To begin our proceedings today, the first thing that I would like to do is to welcome to the stage Michael West, who is going to do a Welcome to Country. Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to say Bujari Gamarua Gadigal. Good day and welcome everyone to Gadigal Country here. We'd also like to acknowledge out there that we're streaming to many different countries out there, many different clans, tribes and nations, the country that you're on. We ask you to learn about the rich history and also understand that as Australians you have a responsibility to look after our culture and our sites, because our culture and sites are not just for Aboriginal people, they're yours to look after for humanity itself as being the oldest living continuous culture in the world today. And, sorry, I'd just like to say too that where we are here is obviously Gadigal. Now, I have been on a journey of educating people. I'm not sure if you've heard me speak before. Now, what is the traditional canoe in Sydney called? Have you had your coffee and have you had retention? Have you had your coffee and do you have retention of what I said before? It's a Nawi. A Nawi is a traditional canoe, bark canoe. Paddling out there in a Nawi, you would be paddling to the other side of the coat hanger, affectionately Sydney Harbour Bridge, that's what we call it. Now, what country is that over there? What clan? Starts with C. Camaragal, yes. And if we turn west and we're heading inland, we're turning left, going under the bridge, and we're paddling along. We look down and we look around us and we see Barani coming in with their calves for a rest, going down to Darling Harbour. What do you think Barani are? If you've been to the ICC, you should have paid attention when you're walking through the door on the right. They're whales, Barani are whales. They'd come in here, rest with their calves down in Darling Harbour. And Darling Harbour has a traditional name that starts with G. Gomera, they'd be resting there. And as we're paddling along, we've gone past Gomera, we look on our left, we're heading towards the Olympic Park. And what would that be? It starts with W. Wongal, correct. And we're paddling, we look on our right, we've gone past Camaragal, we're looking into where the country where Bennelong is resting, Bennelong being a strong partner of a strong Camaragal woman named Barangaroo. What would that be there? It starts with W. Wallamadigal. And then we keep going, and what do we actually hit? What city? Parramatta, yes, but Parramatta's not its traditional name. It's Barra, B-U-R-R-A, Barra meaning eel. It's Barramadigal, so it makes sense, obviously, the eel people there. And those eels, do you know where they migrate to, the eels? Vanuatu is their journey. And there's a whole creation story of Sydney Harbour and the waterways being created by a giant barra. In our language with its double R, it's a chil, so barra, and created the waterways, is now just resting off of Balmain. There's a little island there with its eye looking up to the sky. And that's where those Sydney clans and other Sydney clans would meet. It's transitioning back to the Land Council. Do you know what that island is? Goat Island is its name, but that's not its real name. Its real name is M-E-M-E-L, Meemel, Eye of the Eel. So it's a very important cultural place, as I said, where we meet there. And also, just over on the other side, we have whale. I was going to say, not too many side shots of me, thanks. I've still got COVID kilos to lose, I think as a few of us have. I am trying. I've gone back to the gym and I'm doing walking. Still a bit to go. Unfortunately, with Christmas coming up, that's a bit of a temptation, isn't it? And we all need a laugh, I think, the times we're living. But yeah, over on Ball's Head and that there is the coal loader and everything out that way, and there's actually a whale engraving, a whaling of Barani. And all the animals, as we see are part of our totems. Different clans and different tribes and nations have totems as part of who they are, and also plants. So obviously many of you do have reconciliation action plans and working with Aboriginal people, that when you do have things like NAIDOC and that, do make sure that you do important to have everything clearly labelled, because the animals that are totems, like Barani for the Gadigal people here and other waterways people, is a respected person, respected as part of us, and it's like our brothers and sisters, our family members. So it's important to remember that. You also have other ones. Dinawan is in central New South Wales. That means emu, and there's other totems too, and other animals that are very important. Everybody knows the sacred ibis. Yes, the sacred ibis. Please don't call me a bin chicken. Thank you. It's a sacred ibis. Yes, it's a sacred ibis. It has a whole cultural story of why they've got the red on them, on their body. And also the reason why are they now we didn't see them much a long time ago, but now we see a lot of them around, don't we? Yes, and why is that? It's because we haven't cared for country, and they've had to come and live with us now. It's important that we remember that they may look a little bit dirty, they may be going through the bins, but that's on us for not caring for country. The same as like with Happy Feet. Everybody loves Happy Feet, don't you? And your kids love Happy Feet. Unfortunately, what's happened the last few months is that the whole generation of the chicks has fallen in the water and died and become food for predators because we didn't care for country, the ice melted, and we really need to think about these things if we're going to leave the planet in a better place for the younger people coming through. And we need to remember that. It's important we do take a moment's silence to pay respects to ancestors, pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition owners, elders and custodians of the past and present, pay respects to those we've lost in this pandemic the last few years, and we still are going through a pandemic. I know that's depressing, but we still are. And we've just got a new wave that's happening. So it's important to remember they had their own dreams, their own names, their own aspirations, their own families and communities, that we remember them and be better citizens coming out the other side. Not only Australian citizens, but global citizens, I think we need to be in these tumultuous times that we live, and reflect your journey here right now. So if we have a moment's silence, a moment of reflection and paying respect. We have 3 beautiful waterways, which are the boundaries of the Eora Nation. What are they? Georges, Hawkesbury and Nepean, correct. They're the 3 aquatic boundaries of the Eora Nation. To any of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, in person here or online, we'd like to welcome you from your country, your clan, your tribe, your nation. And to all our brothers and sisters, we belong to one big mob, and what's that called? Afraid to talk? Starts with H. Humanity. Yes, humanity. We all belong to humanity. We welcome from your family, your neighbourhood, community, ultimately the country you come from. We share a little blue planet floating through the ever-expanding cosmos. So our elders and members welcome everyone here. It's a pretty important conversation, I think, immigration. We need to always treat people with dignity and respect in our conversations. I think it's important. Treat people the way you want to be treated is what my parents told me. And I think that's a good rule. And look, we've had the referendum recently. It wasn't the way that Aboriginal people wanted it to go. But there's been a lot of interesting things said, one might say. I heard someone say that colonisation has been good for us. I don't think that's been, for me as a member of the stolen generations, I don't think that's been good for me, my family or community. And you ask anyone, any country that's been colonised, I'm sure they would say that it hasn't been good for them. And there's been things said like it's given us running water and food. I actually thought we had running water. They're called rivers and streams. Yes? Rivers and streams. And we had food, which is all around us, bush tucker. and we could live off the land. Now, unfortunately, communities don't have running water and they don't have food. The running water is polluted, and aquifers and rivers and streams. We need to remember that. They haven't been caring for country. We need to get back for caring for that. And they have to ship bottled water in. And also, when you think about it, food is many, many times what we pay in the city here through freight and transport, and that it's not always the high quality that we have here in the city, and we need to remember that. We're one of the richest countries in the world. Why can't we have better outcomes for Aboriginal people? And if it's been great for us, why do we have a thing called Close the Gap? Yes, we have every year a report. I'll leave you with those thoughts. I'm just stating facts of things I think is important. Always was, and what is it? Aboriginal land never ceded. Thanks.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for being with us here today for CEDA's annual Migration Conference, and welcome to those who are online. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me, my name is Melinda Salento. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and it is really great to have you all with us and taking part in what I think is a very important conversation. Can I start by thanking Michael, who's headed out, but thank Michael for his welcome to country. I always think it's fantastic to hear the stories, and I really appreciate Michael taking the time to establish us in this place, which is a very important one. I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to their elders past and present, to acknowledge their custodianship of land and culture, and to thank them for sharing that with us in the spirit of reconciliation. Michael referenced the referendum. It's the shadow that we're all under at the moment, I think, for those of us who are supporters of reconciliation. And I think it's important that we continue to reflect on and respect that important connection to place, the longest continuing culture in the world, be proud of that, and each and every one of us to think about how we can respect the intent of the voice and give effect to that in any way that we can. Particularly for non-Indigenous Australians, I think there is a responsibility for us now more than ever to be strong allies and strong supporters of the intent of the voice. At the outset of this conference too, I would really like to thank our sponsors. We can't hold these events without the sponsors that we have at CEDA, who support us not only in holding these conferences, but in so much more that we do. Our major sponsor today is Fragaman, who have been long-standing supporters of CEDA's migration work, and I'd like to thank them, and our supporting sponsors, Vet Assess. As I said, they help us run events like this, but increasingly what we're also doing is working with our members to understand their insights and perspectives on really important issues like migration, and their views and insights really help us to shape policy, and I think to ensure that our policy remains relevant both to our members, but I think also increasingly relevant to policy makers as they try to understand the way policy has impact every day throughout the economy. For you in the audience, we always love to encourage you to get involved in our conversations. You can do that via our Pigeonhole platform, which will let you ask questions and vote on the questions of others. And hopefully the information is up on the screen, and it should be on the QR codes on your tables. And for those online, it should be on your screen as well. The password for today is 2023 migration, all caps. And so you can jump on each of the sessions, ask questions or vote on questions that others have asked. And if you're on social media, please feel free to tag us CEDA_news. CEDA is an organisation that is dedicated to shaping Australia's long-term economic growth, development and prosperity. Immigration, of course, is critical to that. There's no doubt that immigration will continue to be an important enabler of economic growth and prosperity, and also, of course, has very critical bearing on the social fabric of our nation. It's not surprising, therefore, that there is really considerable interest in the government's formal response to the immigration review, which it initiated, and in the detail of a revamped immigration strategy, which we're hoping to see soon. Certainly anyone who's been reading the papers or watching the TV or listening to the radio in recent weeks will have noticed that there has been a growing attention on the scale of immigration and its impacts on our economy. Given the important role that immigration does play, and also given the acute skill shortages that we have in this country at the moment, I think it's really important that the public debate is well informed and considered. And I think from that perspective, today's conference could not come at a better time. To set the scene for our discussions today, it is my great pleasure to invite the Honourable Andrew Giles, Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, to present our opening address, after which I'm going to join him on stage for a Q&A. Minister, thank you.
The stage with music like that, Melinda. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. It was a pleasure to be asked last year, but a particular pleasure always to be invited back to an event, particularly after a very quiet week in the immigration portfolio. So, Melinda, I thank you and the whole team at CEDA for this kind invitation and the opportunity to engage with the people in the room and those watching and hopefully also participating online. It was wonderful to be present for Michael's typically thoughtful and generous welcome to country, and I want to begin my remarks by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as traditional custodians of the land upon which this conference is physically taking place today, and I also acknowledge the custodians of the lands upon which all participants are watching the event online. I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people participating. When I think about immigration, I think about nation building. And I think the strongest marker of that is the pathway to Australian citizenship. And as of just over a week ago, more than 6 million people have chosen to become Australians since we first introduced citizenship to law in 1949. And it's important to reflect upon the dramatically different picture of what our country is and what it can be, which has emerged over these decades, of a country in so many ways built by migration. Today, well over half of Australian residents have either been born overseas or have a parent born overseas. A wide range of languages are spoken in Australian homes, and Australians practice an equally wide variety of faiths. Recognising this is important, as is the way governments have supported the journey of settlement, the process of recent migrants becoming Australians rather than remaining as guest workers in this country. Through programs like the AMEP and a focus on settlement and belonging, Australia has become one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world, and I believe the most successful multicultural society. I'll return to this a bit later in my remarks. Now, much has happened in the 12 months since I last addressed this forum. Something I felt I had a decent hunch about has been confirmed. Good administration, by which I mean the ability to provide certainty in particular, is at the heart of a well-functioning and reform-minded immigration system. Unfortunately, it is the case that our visa system was not well-functioning for some time. The former Liberal government deprioritised and devalued the administration of immigration. And you simply can't reform your way out of a dysfunctional visa system. Addressing the delays and uncertainty we inherited as a government were a condition to securing a migration system that is fit for purpose. With this in mind, the Albanese government has added hundreds of additional staff to support our visa system. This has reduced the number of visa applications waiting to be processed, and it's slashed waiting times. The number of temporary visa applications waiting to be assessed has been reduced by about 70%. Visa applications for nurses and teachers are being turned around in a matter of days, instead of previously over 7 weeks. Overall, the median processing time for a temporary skill shortage visa is 11 days, down from 50. Under the current ministerial direction on visa processing, applications in healthcare or teaching are now given the highest priority. In 2022-2023, this saw large increases in permanent skilled visas for sectors in critical shortage. 3,572 places were delivered in teaching occupations, an increase from 548 the year before. 17,061 were delivered in healthcare, an increase from 8,195 the year before. These are critical priorities of our government: the education of our children and securing a stronger health system for all of us. Now, I know there's much interest in the migration strategy, which I can exclusively reveal I won't be announcing today, Dr. Howe, but I can talk about a number of steps the government has taken to change policy ahead of its release. We've increased the TSMIT, or Temporary Skilled Migration Income Threshold. After almost a decade of deliberately holding down the wage threshold at under $54,000, the government has increased the TSMIT to $70,000 in July. And I make no apology for doing this or doing everything I can to promote wage growth across the economy. And last week I signed some new regulations which will be in effect later this week to end the restrictions on pathways to residency for temporary skilled visa workers. Restricting access to residency for people who have been sponsored for the purpose of skilled work runs completely contrary to so much of what makes Australian society tick. On that note, we've also progressed a substantial package of measures to address the exploitation of migrant workers. Unfortunately, there is the structural exploitation of vulnerable workers in this country, and far too often it is the case that these are workers who hold temporary visas. And so we've provided more resources to enforcement, ensuring employers who do the wrong thing and mistreat workers in vulnerable positions are found and sanctioned too. Because we cannot have a race to the bottom on wages and conditions in and of itself, and in terms of its impact on the social licence for the sort of migration policy that would and should, to coin a phrase, help us unlock our potential. There is legislation currently in the Senate to create criminal penalties for exploitative behaviour and new enforcement tools to send a message to those employers who flout the law. We've also sought to promote more broadly permanent residency and address the growing number of those permanently temporary in Australia. As a marker of this, the time taken to assess citizenship applications is now halved, and for the first time in over 6 years there are less than 100,000 applications in the system. While the visa system is of course more efficient in delivering more certainty than it has in a long time, we've also created a direct pathway to citizenship for New Zealand citizens instead of leaving them in limbo. Already over 20,000 New Zealanders have sought Australian citizenship since the 1st of July. These are changes that matter. They matter in that they affect lives each and every day, but beyond that, because they are shaping our society through these individual changes having a cumulative impact. Now, I want to dwell a little bit on one specific change we have progressed, and recognise too, Melinda, that CEDA have made a very significant contribution to public debate on aged care. Now, I should be clear, I don't agree with each and every recommendation which has been put forward, but I want to recognise the fact that CEDA has stumped up and thought through such a complex and critical policy area is welcome. As some in this room may know, the Minister for Aged Care and I announced in May a new approach as for how aged care providers can sponsor overseas workers. This is through the Aged Care Labour Agreement, which is a tripartite approach, with streamlined access provided for aged care providers who enter into a memorandum of understanding with the relevant union. This is a process that's been carefully designed. The Labour Agreement ensures sponsored overseas workers are able to receive information from union in the first 7 days after they begin work. There's also a formal consultation mechanism for providers and unions to engage. And after 6 months, there are now 21 Labour agreements in effect, and a further 4 waiting on a decision from the department. These are agreements which provide for up to 9,000 visas over the next 5 years. This is significant, but I don't suggest that it's a silver bullet. As the Minister for Immigration, I understand that higher wages are frankly the primary way to address shortages where demand for aged care services outstrips workforce supply. That's why, of course, the government has invested $11 billion to support the recent Fair Work Commission decision to substantially increase wages in the sector. Now, I also understand that there are people here who are concerned about the approach, who oppose a tripartite approach per se, or see it as clunky or perhaps unnecessary. Well, I don't. I see this kind of approach as central as to how we can further address workforce needs in a considered and appropriate manner in sectors like this. A tripartite approach may not always look exactly like this agreement, but the principle of business and unions and government working together ensures, I believe, that we're much better placed than any alternative arrangement. Now, building on some of the introductory remarks of Melinda, I think it is important that I say a few words about net overseas migration. Simply put, NOM is of course a demographic measure, the difference between the gain, those arriving, and the loss, those leaving, to the population through immigration and emigration. Now, to be counted, you need to be in Australia for 12 of the previous 16 months. So tourists coming from a quick visit or Australians going overseas to a break don't impact the NOM. And of course, this does not just include people who hold a visa, but Australian citizens who come and go too. The recent high net overseas migration figures reflect a rebound from the years of COVID-related border restrictions. At its lowest point, we had a net loss of 85,000, the first loss since World War II. The rebound from these historically low numbers includes some migrants coming to Australia now who would otherwise come here to study or work when the border was closed. For example, we had multiple groups of international students, that is first, second and third year students, arriving at the same time for the start of this academic year. And of course there will be an update to the net overseas migration forecasts as is standard before the end of the year. But with that in mind, I want to touch on a series of measures that we have put in place that will put downward pressure on the rate of net overseas migration, ending COVID concessions, recapping the number of hours international students can work, and restricting and ceasing the pandemic event visa. And we have also taken a series of actions on promoting integrity measures. Key among the accepted recommendations of the Nixon Review was addressing the protection visa framework. And we have begun to address the integrity of the asylum framework through supporting real-time processing of claims. Now, during almost a decade of neglect, combined with underinvestment and indeed mismanagement by the former government, backlogs in this system grew exponentially. This happened across the entire migration system. However, delays in processing reviewing onshore protection visa applications in particular have blown out with very significant consequences. Not least, it's absolutely crucial that our asylum framework functions effectively to provide certainty to those in need of our protection. And with that in mind, we've recently invested over $160 million to improve protection visa assessments and also to increase capacity at the AAT and in the courts to hear these matters quickly. We're also implementing reforms to strengthen the integrity of the international education sector from those who might attempt to game that system or exploit students. These changes include strengthening aspects of the Relevant Education Act to collusive business activities, agent performance benchmarks, and banning agent commission for onshore transfers. Most students, of course, come to Australia for legitimate reasons, to study. Our international education sector is, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows and appreciates, incredibly important to Australia and for Australians. At the same time, it is the case that we can balance the promotion of this critical industry with the right process for visa applications. And with that in mind, we have taken substantial steps to advance these objectives, including closing a loophole allowing education providers to use concurrent enrolment to shift some international students from genuine study to arrangements designed to facilitate access to work in Australia. Increasing the amount of savings needed to get a visa, reflecting the higher living expenses that everyone is experiencing. Applying higher scrutiny to reduce fraud in visa applications, and announcing the government will consider using powers under the Education Services for Overseas Students Act to prevent high-risk education providers from being able to recruit international students. After nearly a decade of neglect, these are measures that will help improve the integrity of our visa system and, in so doing, support our international education industry. Now, I touched on earlier my apprehension that many of you are keen to see the release of the government's migration strategy, and it will be released shortly. Reshaping our migration systems and how we compete in the global race for skilled workers is going to become increasingly critical to Australia's future prosperity. The Parkinson Review, and I acknowledge Dr. Joanna Howe in the room, was the first comprehensive review of our migration system in a generation. And the review in itself is a really good and very extensive piece of work. It points to a number of really important areas for reform. For too long, underpinning this, there has also been a lack of clarity in what we are in fact trying to achieve through any such reform. As announced by Minister O'Neill earlier this year, 5 core objectives will underpin our recalibrated migration system. We will be first, building Australia's prosperity by lifting productivity, meeting workforce needs and supporting experts. Enabling a fair labour market, including by complementing the jobs, wages and conditions of Australian workers. Building a community of Australians. Protecting Australia's interests in the world and providing a fast, efficient and fair system. Now, there will be much more to say when the strategy is released, but these objectives are and will continue to be central to everything we do, as I hope is demonstrated by many of the changes we have made and which I have outlined today. Higher wages, a more expansive access to citizenship and an efficient visa system. Now, I want to finish my remarks by speaking about multiculturalism. In my view, the greatest achievement of modern Australia. Indeed, too often we fail to clearly state how important this is. Our diversity is our greatest strength, socially, culturally and economically too. But it can't be taken for granted. It must not. We are part of the fastest growing region in human history, and our diaspora communities carry strong connections everywhere across it. This is an advantage that can't be squandered. Now, last week though, the Scanlon Foundation set out a challenging set of circumstances regarding our social cohesion. And each day, that social cohesion is affected by the impacts of Australians of the Israel-Hamas conflict and the daily images we see from Gaza. Political leadership demands a response. Standing against all the voices of hate and of division is the right thing to do, because in challenging times, it's the Australian way to stick together to help one another get through. And because racism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia hurt us all, because there is no place for hate of any kind in our society, but also because our national interest demands this too. And this is why recent comments by the former Prime Minister, Mr Howard, were so appalling. He says he has always had trouble with multiculturalism. Now, I was unsurprised to hear these comments because, of course, he called for a slowdown in Asian migration as opposition leader. His own colleague, later Migration Minister Philip Ruddock, crossed the floor of the Parliament to vote with the Hawke government to reaffirm a non-discriminatory approach to migration. Mr Howard then deprioritised institutional frameworks to support our multicultural society. The Howard government's first budget systematically eliminated funding to anything related to multiculturalism. And last week, the opposition leader, weaponised anti-Semitism for his own political interests over the national interest. Mr Dutton has a history of seeking division and promoting discord. Malcolm Turnbull knew this when he became Prime Minister and chose not to appoint him to his National Security Committee. The opposition leader has singled out communities using incendiary remarks on multiple occasions. For years he supported the abolition of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. He failed to support anti-vilification provisions in the proposed bill to address religious discrimination. There is a history, up to and including last week, of damaging and destructive contributions to public debate and to our shared sense of social cohesion, an inability to say or do anything positive in this respect. Our conversation about social cohesion and Australian multiculturalism needs to be better than this. And this is why I look forward to receiving the Multicultural Framework Review early next year. I commissioned this review earlier this year to explore what more we can do working together. And for the first time, this was a review process in respect of which submissions were invited in any language. Over 800 received, more than 120 of them in languages other than English, often received in formats including oral and video rather than written. This demonstrates, as I said a moment ago, that we can do better. And I say beyond this that we will, through respectful engagement, careful listening, and valuing what everyone brings to our multicultural society, recognising the strengths of Australia's unrivalled diversity. And the next step is, of course, to link this to an efficient, well-designed migration program that connects Australia and Australians to the world, in our national interest, well into the future, unlocking our potential. Thank you very much for having me. I really look forward to engaging in dialogue today and into that future. Thank you. Mine left or the right?
Left is good, thank you. Well, thank you, Minister. As disappointed as we are that you're not announcing the strategy today, we'll move on.
That's very good of you, Melinda.
Firstly, can I just, I actually just wanted to make sure that people understood my sort of opening comments around where we are with cost of living pressures. And I think my concern is, at the moment, is that fully understanding that people are worried about house prices and cost of living pressures and the impact that that's having on household budgets. But I guess I am concerned that there's a very strong focus on the migration element of it, where there's a lot of nuance that sits beneath it. We know, particularly in the housing sector, there's a lot of other things going on. We saw that through COVID, changing numbers of in the way households are formed and smaller household sizes. And so there's just a lot of moving pieces there. I think it would be really unfortunate if only one kind of policy lever is the focus, and that we end up seeing migration sort of being a scapegoat for a broader range of pressures, and actually acknowledging that we continue to hear from business that there are considerable skill shortages. You referenced our aged care engagement. We know that aged care homes, as an example, are struggling to keep themselves open or keep as many beds available because they can't get the workers. So there's a lot to this, and I guess I just find it a little bit concerning if it ends up being shoot at home as just one issue that we need to focus on, and not a broader range of issues. Having said that, it is one of the issues that's here in the questions around how you're seeing the impact on cost of living pressures and how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, look, it's a fundamental question, and I think there's two big dimensions to it. There's finding a way to recognise that there are real challenges to having a deeply considered policy debate on issues of this nature, as I've experienced in a different element of my portfolio over the last week or so. I think we can't take for granted the social licence for a well-designed migration program, and I think we have to recognise that through those two lenses. One, the impact that this debate has on individuals in the Australian community, which can't be overlooked right now. But secondly, our capacity to anchor this debate in something closer to the facts. And the first fact is to recognise that Australians are doing it tough right now. that the economic circumstances we find ourselves in are really putting pressure on households. And the focus of the government has to be and is on finding ways to relieve those pressures, recognising the inflation dimension of that puts a particular challenge that hasn't really been a feature of our public policy debate for some time. But we also have to recognise that the way through will never be achieved through scapegoating, and which recognises all of these impacts in all of their complexity. And I'd say this to people in this room, that when I travel around the country and meet with state premiers and territory chief ministers or most business leaders, they're obviously interested in using the migration levers more effectively or more expansively to deal with skills and labour shortages, and I will understand that. What we need to do is to build a bridge between that understanding and some of the basic facts around some of the skill shortages in particular, with an appreciation that for many Australians who are struggling to get by and whose focus is on their mortgage repayments or finding a place to rent, that these two lines of effort are not running against one another. And that is a really complicated challenge, but it's one that frankly requires not only consistent leadership from government, and I would say political leadership more broadly, but a considered engagement from the business community as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in Western Australia last week and was talking to people there about it, and it seems to have a different complexion, this conversation in the West, and I suspect that's because the skill shortage dynamic is playing, really clearly, and as they contemplate the energy transition piece over there, it's sort of more focused on that, if you like, and understanding the role that migration can play in addressing some of the bottlenecks that they have. So I do think it's important that we all keep talking about it. And that we reflect the various elements of the conversation that need to sort of be unpacked. So thank you for your comments. Minister, in your speech you spoke to the 5 principles that have framed the government's thinking about the strategy. I'm just wondering if you might sort of talk a little bit more about how you think they sit together, and as you've gone through the consultations, how you're thinking about balancing some issues that sometimes are competing priorities, if you like, and how you're thinking about compromise in the design of the system.
Yeah, look, that is a great question, and it perhaps goes to the heart of the policy response that will sit underneath those principles that will be articulated in the migration strategy. But I'd make maybe a couple of broad points. One is that this is an area of policy making that is particularly iterative, in that there is never the opportunity to set and forget in the policy settings. And I think people in this room will appreciate that, both in and of itself in terms of what we do in our domestic settings, but we also can't ignore the fact that many of the skilled migrants that we are looking to attract aren't solely focused on what Australia's visa settings and pathways to residency, permanent residency look like. They're looking at the settings in other nations too. So make that as sort of my headline issue, that there's what are we trying to do? How does it relate to the other offers that are in the marketplace? And the building block, I think, for all of it has 2 elements. One, us being clear about what it is that we are trying to do with the migration system and how it relates to the other instruments of Australian public policy making. And I often say that I think our immigration system should better be understood as something that's facilitative, not determinative of wider public policy outcomes. And I think we see that through the debate around higher education policy as an example of where we've had the migration incentives running ahead of the purpose for which those visa offerings were sought. So I think that's another element. The other one, which I started by talking about, which I think is possibly the least sexy element of this debate, but perhaps the most important, is effective and efficient and fair administration, I think, trumps just about everything else. It doesn't matter how good and well thought out your policy settings are if people aren't seeing the certainty in decision making. And certainly from employers, the constant message I hear is that a quick yes is great, a quick no is not great, but it's much better than a prolonged maybe. And I think we see that especially where we are looking at in-demand skills, and there may be debates about fees and other aspects, but fundamentally it's for someone who's thinking about shifting their life somewhere a long way away. Having that certainty over the journey is fundamentally important. to get to the things that you talked about that perhaps need to be reconciled, I'm more optimistic than perhaps your question indicated. I think equity and efficiency, by and large, run together in this system, a system that is well designed. And I think the other element to it is to ensure that as we think about those migration settings that will drive productivity growth, obviously driving wages growth, or preventing a sense in the community that skilled migration can be a drag on wages growth. I think the things run together.
Yeah. I'm certainly on a unity ticket with you on that. It's just, there's a lot in this. There's a lot of different organisations have different objectives, and all the way through the consultations, I think there's been this strong sort of message around trying to find the path through that, which is sort of where I was going with the question in terms of recognising there are times when things aren't going to sit neatly next to each other, but how you find that positive line through.
Yeah. And I think, for me, restating the high-level principles, which I think there is broad agreement in the community, in the business community, amongst unions, amongst most academic commentators, I think that provides a clearer basis to reconcile some of those tension points, which we are going to come through. And from my point of view, what I've been trying to do is to spend, I say this possibly slightly hypocritically, at this precise moment in time, to try to be more listening than talking in some of these conversations, to understand how the people who are engaging with this system experience it, and to make sure that their experiences are brought more closely into our consideration as policymakers.
Yeah. Your comments about uncertainty, I think, are very well made, and I know from my conversations with our members that the additional resources to get rid of the backlogs and to improve timeliness has been really, really important. But I do think it's one of the reasons why they're also very keen to see where the strategy is going, because they're sort of wondering sort of what the shape of it is going to look like. So a bit of context there. I've got one question, but I think Michael Rose is in the room, and I think we've got a microphone as well, and so I was going to ask Michael, he's got a question in here, if he wouldn't mind asking it, if we can get a microphone over to him here, and I'll ask one more question in the meantime. Top of the list in votes from the audience, Minister, is a question around plans for family reunions for refugees in Australia.
Well, that's I don't know if there is to be more specificity about that, or people want some general comments.
It's what are your plans for family reunions for refugees in Australia?
Well, I guess probably the first step we took was getting rid of Ministerial Direction 80, which was probably the main barrier to family reunion, impacting a very large number of refugees. I think when we think about how our program operates, this is a really, really big question, and with both a sort of high-level policy focus, but also some technical questions that underpin it. If you look at our humanitarian intake, which increasing it to 20,000 a year is my proudest achievement as Immigration Minister, there are two bits to it really, leaving aside the onshore component. There are the direct entries, and then there's the special humanitarian visas, which in large part reflect some form of family connection to people in Australia. Then you've got the other issues, and I look at people in this room who are very involved in various forms of complementary protection. The CSP, the conversations about expanded complementary protection also point to the imperative of facilitating the connection between people in Australia from refugee backgrounds and people who are desperately in need of protection. In how many weeks is it? 4 weeks, I'll be in Geneva leading the Australian delegation to the Global Refugee Forum, and I think this is an incredibly important juncture for the world. Every time I speak, I have the sad opportunity to recognise that we now have more refugees than ever before in human history. There are about 35 million in the world right now, 114-ish million displaced people. Last year, the world probably resettled not many more than 100,000. So if we think about the scale of the challenge, it's not just about increasing the formal intake that governments like ours do, and I'm really pleased that Secretary Blinken is doing some really fantastic work in the United States, but it's about making sure that we leave no stone unturned in terms of finding pathways to people who need a permanent solution. Now, that won't always be resettlement in a country like ours. There are other durable solutions, but it's an absolutely critical question.
Great, and I'm going to apologise to my team because I'm supposed to be finishing now, but I do want to give Michael a chance to ask his question if he can. Thanks.
Yes, hi. My question's around apprenticeships, and you can come into the country myriad of different ways, but for a student to come in and undertake an apprenticeship doesn't seem to be a pathway that's an easier, alignable approach. We know there's a skills shortage in different industries and the like, and there's a labour shortage as well. So I think if there's is that a possibility to create an apprenticeship visa as such? So international students can come in, they can come in and study at universities and the higher education, but for the vet sector in the labour industry, really.
Yeah, it obviously hasn't been a feature of how we've approached it. My first comment would be to reiterate what I said a little while ago, in that I think in areas such as this, our visa system, our migration program should support the substantive policy approach in the area of skills, and I think that world looks quite a bit different now than it did when I addressed this conference a year ago, now that Jobs and Skills Australia is up and running, and it's allowing us through the councils to give a clearer picture of not just current demand but likely future demand, so that we can find ways to identify where we do have structural skill shortages, as well as the ones that perhaps might be more temporary. In terms of the specific apprenticeship pathway, I think I will defer the first bit of the question to my good friend Minister O'Connor, but I think we do have to recognise that there are, on the one hand, some challenges to student visas in the vet sector particularly, but also that there have been some very significant opportunities there. One thing that Minister O'Connor has been keen about is the more traditional export orientation of this, so the provision of skills through Australian understanding and organisations to be conducted offshore. So there's a range of ways in which the headline issue that you've referred to can be addressed, some of which will probably involve or can involve a reconsideration of the visa system.
Well, thanks for that, and thank you so much for making the time to be with us again this year. To the audience, there were a ton of questions in there, and so I think what we'll do is we obviously keep those questions. We'll have a look at what comes out of the strategy, and we'll think about how we can perhaps look to get some answers to some of those questions, and or see if we can encourage the minister to come back and deal with those as well as at a future date. Now I've got to put a little leg rope around him. But if you can join me in thanking the Minister, and I'll invite my panellists up. Thanks. Thank you so much. That was great. Can we just grab a quick photo? So our panellists are going to come up, and then we'll be off to the races. If you click on the next section, you can start your questions in there too. Oh yeah, of course. Thanks. No, it's fine. Get a bit closer over here. So let me introduce our panellists for the next session, and I think there'll be questions that you asked of the Minister, which you might reframe in a different sense to at least get an understanding of what our panellists might be looking for in terms of announcements. But first, let me tell you who we've got on stage. We have, as the Minister has mentioned, Dr. Joanna Howe, who's a Professor in Law from University of Adelaide and who will be known to many of you in the room as one of the three-person panel that undertook the review of the migration system for the federal government. And we've got Teresa Liu, who is the Managing Partner of Fragamin Australia, New Zealand, both right across all of the issues As I said, Pigeonhole, if you'd like to ask questions, just click on the Q&A for the next session, and I look forward to seeing all of those. But let me get the conversation started. You're both really familiar with the sort of outline of where the government's heading. You heard the Minister again speak to what they're trying to achieve. Perhaps starting with you, Joanna, which of the particular areas are you very focused on and really hoping to see some progress on?
Thank you, and thanks Melinda and the CEDA team for having me. I think for me as a reviewer, one of the things we were really keen to get right is to understand the role of regulatory design in producing migration outcomes. So whether that's making it harder for employers to access the workers they need or inviting vulnerability and exploitation for workers, we really forefronted the role of regulatory design and the way we structure visas. And so coming out of the review, one of the key takeaways for me is that we need to do skilled migration better. We kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach, but in a country as diverse as Australia with different sectors and different scales of employers and regional nuances, a one-size-fits-all approach is probably not the best approach. There has to be universal principles that govern migration, but in my view, one of the key contributions of the review was to recognise that if you have a high-skilled worker, perhaps an ICT worker, they're on a high wage, they're therefore generally protected in the labour market from exploitation by their high skill and high wage. It doesn't mean that they're not capable of being exploited, but it does mean that the risk is significantly lowered. And so the idea of a fast-tracked approach for that cohort is really important, and so that employers aren't waiting and their needs are met very efficiently. One of the things that the whole system is meant to do is to address skill shortages, but we recognised in the review that there wasn't a robust process to determine skill shortages. We sort of were relying on a 2001 ANSCO list that doesn't have emerging occupations, has not been updated since 2001, and that there were big bottlenecks around how employers could access overseas workers because of the use and the reliance on that list. So for me, a key contribution coming out of the review is to look at the role of Jobs and Skills Australia, as the Minister mentioned, in terms of being pivotal to the migration system. We've always kind of had, AURPA, the National Skills Commission, but they've never had a specific focus or remit on migration, and the review for the first time really connected domestic skills and training with migration and a need to have consistent skills approach across both. And then going down the ladder, trying to understand the relationship between wages and conditions and shortages. So coming out of the pandemic, there was data to suggest that almost a third of occupations were in shortage. So trying to understand, is that a shortage because there isn't enough Australian workers, or are there not enough Australian workers willing to work at those low wages at those conditions? And I think understanding the relationship between shortages, wages and conditions is also something that Jobs and Skills Australia can do to make sure that we have the social licence for migration. And then finally, the sectoral approach for low-skilled migration. I noticed that CEDA does have a recommendation about an essential skills visa, which I think New Zealand has sort of pioneered that approach for low-skilled work. I personally am far more in favour of the sectoral approach that the Minister outlined in terms of aged care. So let's be upfront, it is more time consuming to try and get the parties together. And in the aged care sector, there was not just one union, there was a number of unions, there was a number of employer peak bodies. But the ability to get that negotiation around that agreement and to get people to agree means it's much more sustainable in the long term. And I think that that's actually a really significant feat of Minister Giles' team to be able to do that. And the reality about the low-skilled, low-wage sectors is if we have an essential skills visa that just is an open-door approach, we're not mitigating the risks associated with those sectors in terms of vulnerability and exploitation, and we've seen that in New Zealand come to the fore, but we've also seen that in Australia in certain sectors there is a norm of non-compliance with labour standards. So I would prefer that we have a fast-track system for the high-skilled, that we're working on how we deal with the middle efficiently, but that for the low-wage, low-skilled sectors, it's a sectoral approach where you build deep tripartite support. And that way you don't have a situation where you announce an ag visa on the run because Britain removes its workers from the 88 days, and so we lose 10,000 ag visa workers overnight, and then the last government announces an ag visa on the run without even consulting, the Minister for the Pacific, who ended up being opposed to it, or the unions. And then you get, I spoke to many growers who then started planting and preparing on the back of that announcement of an ag visa with Southeast Asian nations. But then you get a new Labor government elected, and they scrap the ag visa because the hard work wasn't done, both in terms of our obligations to the Pacific, but also in terms of getting the unions on board. And so then growers are left back at square one. So, I really believe that the sectoral approach for low-skilled, while it's harder and takes longer, it is actually important in terms of building sustainable migration settings for the long term.
Yeah, I think just on that, I think in principle agree. I think what we're hearing from members is just the cost and the time involved, particularly for a sector where a large number of providers are really actually not making enough money. Like they're not even able to sort of cover their costs at the moment. So I think it's just finding that balance, but certainly that intent around making sure that you've also got the better wage outcomes and the training and career pathway are front and
Can I just ask you, so not making enough money in terms of to cover the costs of migration, or?
Oh, they're actually just struggling, full stop.
Yes, but I guess that's where I would say it's not the role of the migration system.
No, I agree.
To help Australian employers who can't pay their workers appropriately.
I'm just saying that's just the high level concern there. Yeah. There's a lot more in there than that. Yeah. So I totally agree. Anyway, we can have that conversation another day. Teresa, what are the key issues for you?
Thank you, and So Joanna, she's obviously so across, lives and breathes all of this. I've been listening quite a bit to what you've said. The first thing I'd say is I think business is wanting reform. Reform is really necessary. And really briefly, just hearing Minister Giles and particularly the conversation just then, what gives me some comfort is he's taken your report so seriously. He's obviously considering a lot of elements, not just economic, but social cohesion. And that gives me quite a lot of comfort in terms of building a robust, portable system into the future. So I just wanted to mention that. In terms of, some of the priorities that I kind of see, and I think I'll just feed off some of your comments, and go into a little bit of a detail in terms of what business is telling us when we work with them. Fundamentally, this issue around the program that it exists now, it is still very much for skilled labour. So having reforms that accommodate very much for semi-skilled, lower skilled sectors, including protections of workers, is really important. That's something that our clients are very much looking forward to, and with speed around what those reforms are very much going to look like. On that sector approach that you mentioned, I know that internationally there's quite a few countries that are going down or starting to go down that path. So whether it's in agriculture, in health or nursing and so on, looking at that kind of more life cycle to make sure that before it even gets to a visa stage, that there is more of those kind of elements predetermined and protections that happen as well. So just wanted to mention that on the sector approach. But I think there's a couple of things I wanted to mention as well, just on the occupations list. Absolutely agree. I think if we had more evidence-based data around, occupations, that's really necessary into the future. And then what are those complementary reforms that I feel need to happen around issues like TISMET, minimum salary level, and also around kind of like, I'll just say kind of cost of living. And again, there's some countries that are toying around with different approaches there. I think that's really important. And I think just overall, the simplification of the system. We do have a really complex system. So it started off, very much on a skilled basis, and then we started to just bolt on different, aspects, so things to accommodate for regional Australia, for sectors and so on. And it makes it, a pretty complicated process. But outside those rules as well, it is around simplification of that ecosystem, I think. So when before it actually even gets to a visa, how do you determine that pathway? What's their future role? How do you recognise someone's skills and make them, I'll say, more useful here rather than trying to get what they need to do overseas and coming back in? And also from a compliance point of view, we have a lot of policy at the front end that is there to support the vulnerable. But I think sometimes maybe there should be a better balance between the front end of efficiency and the back end of actually when that individual is here, and what are the protections that can be afforded through, you know, strong employment laws, through information sharing with the ATO and so on. So just they're kind of a few kind of comments I kind of wanted to make, and off the back of your comments as well, Joanna.
Yeah, I think that point is really well made. I think that's where Joanna was going as well, just in terms of we've seen exploitation as an issue for vulnerable workers and low-paid workers. We've seen exploitation as an issue where your visa status is tied to an employer. And so they're all issues that have been addressed. But I do think there's this nexus between, as you said, Teresa, you know, what domestic employment laws can and should be doing, and then what we're trying to achieve in the migration system. There's two issues I just want to pull out in a little bit more detail, and the questions are coming in thick and fast, so I've lost it. But I know, Teresa, that one of the things you wanted to talk about was skill recognition. And the challenge that exists at the moment with that. And then the other thing I thought we could talk about is mobility, and also the sort of regional dimensions as well. But Teresa, did you want to just talk a bit about where we're at with skills recognition?
Yeah, and I think this goes to the ecosystem kind of point that it can take, to be honest, a really long time for, say, a registered nurse who's been registered overseas to come into the country. Takes them really a good period of time, say 12 months, to go through that system, and it's expensive, and then they get registered and then they can move on. So you're looking at different variations of temporary to permanent kind of applications. And some other countries are being pretty proactive. So again, thinking of health and nursing in terms of how can I have these people in earlier and, to be honest, being more useful. So, for instance, Quebec in Canada has a program where they will have French-speaking African nationals, you know, registered, come in, and essentially, you know, through that level of engagement, go through that process, be able to work and work freely outside that sector, and help them along to get that registration, and then become a registered nurse. UK has a pilot program for displaced people, and that's an arrangement with the nursing NHS, which again facilitates that movement as well. And so, you know, I feel that given that we have such a shortage of labour at the moment, and we have skilled people that can fill other occupations or related occupations, what are those mechanisms that we can be a little bit more innovative to bring those people in? And then move them through, you know, their career journey, because I think the reality is most people might come in under one occupation, and the visa program is built on criteria for that one occupation. But in general, that person's going to move on. They're going to change careers. They're going to, you know, move up in the world, etc. So that recognition is really important. The other aspect, which is more on skills assessments and skills assessing authorities as well, is that in many cases that is a precursor to being able to make an application. And again, I think it means, you know, in terms of the level of investment and resources that are, forced onto a lot of assessing authorities to do this, it does mean those applications take, you know, some time. And I also wonder about, you know, would it be great in the ideal world in the future, if we had something like a qualifications type passport that meant that there's a readiness or speediness to actually move people through much more quickly. Because Minister Giles spoke about resources into the department to reduce processing times of the department itself. But if you've got a range of skills assessing authorities on a vast range of occupations, I mean, I'm not sure if they're the same resources that need to also be built up to accommodate for that level of assessment as well. So a couple of comments there.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to it because there's a bunch of related questions actually. Mobility.
Okay, so I also just wanted to say fundamentally, I think we agree, probably everybody in this room, that if you can't get the workers you need and you're prepared to pay them consistent with Australian wages and conditions, you should be able to access overseas labour, and it's not happening efficiently enough. I think that's probably where we were trying to get to at the beginning there. And in terms of mobility, so we've built the system on a sponsored model, which has effectively tied sponsored workers to their employer. Because of, we found in the review, the data shows that on average it takes an Australian worker 3 months to find a new job, and yet within our system, we've toyed over the years since '96 between 28 days to 90 days to allow a temporary migrant to move. Effectively, it tied them. There's enough research to have shown that even with high-skilled workers, it really did create that vulnerability to exploitation that wasn't there. And one of the contributions of the review is to recognise that actually all temporary visa holders are vulnerable in the labour market, but it is to varying degrees. And so one of the things we proposed was allowing temporary migrants to move and to have 6 months to change employers. Now, the Australian did have a front pager which said this would lead to punch-ups with employers in the parking lot trying to determine who would be paying the fees. Would it be employer A who originally sponsored, or employer B who the worker moved to, or C or D, And so I think that exposes the lack of understanding actually about the system. Where I think we need to go is have less upfront fees, and that makes the system more accessible to small businesses like hairdressers to be able to bring these workers in. If you're a good employer and you're treating your workers well, just like with a local worker, an Australian worker, they're not going to move. But if in the competitive marketplace, the labour market, you're not treating your workers well, then giving them that freedom to move, that mobility and portability, it addresses the exploitation issue to a large degree. But it also, creates incentives for employers to do the right thing. And I think if we have it, we can also then start to get rid of some other things. Like, in my view, we need to get rid of the things that take time and cost money. So employer-conducted labour market testing doesn't protect an overseas worker or the local labour market. We should just get rid of it. I actually also have TISMIT in my sights. I think that the government should get rid of TISMIT, because TISMIT was created to make sure the program remained high-skilled and that workers were being paid above a certain amount. But really, that's not where we are today. As long as workers are being paid the market rate. So if you're an aged care worker coming in under that agreement and you're being paid consistently with other aged care workers, then that should be enough. TISMIT shouldn't be part of the equation. So it will take a brave government to get us through these steps. But if, I think Minister Giles and Minister O'Neill are serious about doing some hard reform here. Whether they get to that point here right now, I'm not sure. But I think we need to get to a place where we bring workers in quickly, we make sure they're not vulnerable to exploitation, and we don't hide behind mechanisms that are meant to protect workers but don't actually achieve that.
I absolutely agree with your comments there. Yeah. And I think TISMIT is unusual in the international environment because it actually, people say TISMIT and minimum salary level, but they are different. They're different in this environment. Most other countries have a minimum level to basically ensure a level of protection, but it's really based on market conditions and the market itself. And so TISMIT to me is a pretty old system because it's couched in an Australian migration system of skilled migration, which is still at that higher level. So market rate should be the market rate.
In 1996, when they created the 457 visa, the idea was that it would be a really high-skilled program, but it has become a more general system of labour supply. TISMIT doesn't work. The Deegan Review, even in 2007, said that for the regions, I mean, we know this, she suggested regional TISMITs because effectively the regional labour market people are paying significantly less. And so it locks a lot of regional employers out. And I think that you mentioned regions before. I think that, that's something that we have to get right. We have to work out. We saw in the review 75% of workers that come in through a regional visa end up staying in the regions. So there is a benefit to providing incentives for people to go to the regions. But TISMIT locks them out. I think we need a regional migration strategy because we are effectively two countries in terms of migration.
Teresa, anything on mobility? I mean, from an employer's perspective, how we manage cost?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So, international, like we have this one level of TISMIT, and that determines if it's a sponsory occupation. A lot of other countries do have a minimum salary level, but then it's nuanced. So it's nuanced against the level of the role, if you're a graduate, if you're in a certain sector, profile, so maybe your age. I'm not saying any of these things are perfect, I'm just saying that other countries are toying with this as well because it is a struggle. And one really interesting one that particularly a few European countries are toying with at the moment is cost of living almost. So if you have more dependents or you're living in a certain city location compared to another, then your minimum salary level needs to rise. I'm not saying that's where we should be going, but I think it also goes towards, it is a difficult mechanism in terms of how you determine that, but I think fundamentally it should be market rate. And just in terms of employment law and so on, and thinking about the vulnerable, I think there's been a lot more tightness between immigration law and employment law, and there is currently a bill, I think, moving through Parliament which gives amendments to the Fair Work Act, which essentially mean that currently if you have a visa holder, so a temporary visa holder has a breach in their visa conditions, then their employment contract is null and void, whereas this legislation, if passed, will mean that that contract is not null or void, and they basically can still obtain their rights and entitlements, so wage theft, for instance. So I think that's a really good example, I think, of where, the migration policy program likes to do a lot, and maybe it's time to let other parts of, law kind of support in some areas as well. And that again goes to that simplification element.
So I'm going to try to cobble together two of the questions that I've got here, and I'm going to look to the audience. If you've got a question that you want to ask from the floor, I'm going to ask this question, and you can put your hand up and the mic will come to you and we can go to the floor. Otherwise, I've got a few questions left here as well. There's two questions that are sort of first and third on the list, which I think sort of tie into the same sort of issue. The first one is about people who've come in perhaps as a secondary visa holder with a skilled worker whose skills are lower. How do we think about sort of allowing them as migrants to upskill and to move through the system, if you've got any thoughts? And there is clearly a lot of interest in the audience around the broader question around how migration sits. A very skilled focused migration system, which is all about lifting human capital with the need to continue to upskill people who are here in Australia already. Thoughts?
So on the latter question, I think the role of Jobs and Skills Australia and the Jobs and Skills Councils is really important. So I'm not sure how much understanding there is about how the body works, but Jobs and Skills Australia has a tripartite board that governs it, and then Jobs and Skills Australia, I guess, is labour market economists and others who really do that analysis of what are the needs, skill needs across the country and in different sectors and occupations. But then there's 10 Jobs and Skills Councils that sit underneath, which have unions and employers on them. And in my view, the way that this should work is that those Jobs and Skills Councils should come up with a plan for their sector, and it should have migration in it as well as, TAFE and education and training, and then combined with sort of a sectorial case study-based approach, so through qualitative research, and then the labour market quant analysis that JSA does, we should be coming up with a really finely granulated assessment of what do we need, and we just haven't had those connections in the past. So, in something like agriculture, where I've done the bulk of my research, I think we don't have a strong sense of how to create career pathways for locals who are in that sector. So in my fieldwork, I've interviewed young Australians who've been working in horticulture, but then ultimately want to leave the sector and go somewhere else because they don't see a career pathway, and we should be developing their tech skills because horticulture is becoming high tech, and that these are the gaps that we just don't have at present. And so I do think Jobs and Skills Australia is a fundamental reform, and it's a linchpin of the system. And I think that's going to be really important. The first part of your question was about...
I think it's about migrants who've come in potentially
secondary visa holders.
Yep.
So I think just in response to that, and I'll pass it to you, Teresa, is that we are missing the opportunity to really really leverage off the secondary visa holders. We focus so much on the 482, but actually most 482s bring somebody with them, and so we need to be harnessing their potential. Another area of missed opportunity is international students. When they graduate, what we can see is that I think only 33% work at the top skill level, and yet 78% of Australians, when graduating, work at the top skill level. So with international students, we're somehow failing to really use and harness their potential, and it could be because of their need to go from that graduate study visa to some other kind of visa to stay, so they'll take any job rather than really working on how can we most effectively use their potential. So there are some, I think secondary visa holders and international students are two areas where we're underutilising their skills and mismanaging the transition into the labour market.
Theresa, anything to add?
Yeah, just on the underutilisation of skills and thinking about, I suppose, visa pathways. I think it's also more broadly how we think about migration and how we like to pigeonhole, profiles of people into this is a skilled worker, this is a family-based visa, this is a refugee, displaced person, and looking at the whole of that person or the whole of that family unit in terms of what they can contribute. So I think it kind of goes towards that. Like, how can you draw that out? How can you maybe make that part of a migration process or application process better than it is now? Because I think we see bits of that actually in some programs, but how can we do that more? I was interested when you mentioned regional Australia because, and that 75% remain, and it just reminded me of something which is around, the success of an applicant and they're being retained is that the community welcomes them and they take them on board. So whether it's the secondary applicant finding a job for them, frankly, or helping them with their education or English or whatever, these are all the things that make a success, of a migrant, I think, into that country and that social cohesion. And then just on that jobs and skills and education, the only thing I'd probably just wanted to say is, I think there's still a lot to be done in terms of promoting vocational education in Australia and trying to match education and modernising our education system against the actual needs of industry at the moment. So, and that's broad-based, so whether you're migrant or not.
Yeah, I'm hoping that Jobs and Skills Australia is going to play a pretty important role in a lot of these different issues, and my sort of call out to our members and to businesses to make sure that when it's fully up and running that there's that ongoing engagement, because we've seen some of the problems. Joni, you talked about the classifications and the difficulty in keeping up with that. We want to move more towards a system that's genuinely based on skills and experience rather than where you fit into a code. And that's definitely where it's heading, but I think that's going to have real importance, not just in terms of the migration system, but hopefully more broadly in putting pressure on the system to sort of, whether it's vocational education and training or universities or whatever, to actually understand where the skill needs are and to respond to it. Joanna, I'm just interested too, we talked previously about the role of international students and your view that we're sort of perhaps underutilising them. How important do you think that is in making us an attractive destination for students?
So I think that we do have comparatively quite attractive migration offerings compared to some of our other competitor countries, in that we do offer the graduate student visa, which allows further stay. But there are other countries around the world that are starting to offer a fast-tracked approach to permanent residency for certain high-skilled international students in areas of key demand. And that is something we could look at doing because, a fundamental driver of vulnerability in the labour market is temporariness. And if on average people are cycling through 2 or 3 visas over a period of stay of about 7 to 8 years, we're probably losing them at their best time because they're having to worry about how do I find the way to stay further rather than how do I invest in myself in the labour market to really do what I want to do and really build my skills and experience. So I think that that's probably a missed opportunity and something that we could address, a fast-tracked approach to PR for highly demanded international students in certain occupations.
So there's a question in the app actually around this, but in the context of the aged care visa.
Yep. Okay.
And because you can you're fast track for permanent residency after 2 years if you're working in the sector. Do you think that that creates a concern that people who are wanting to come and study at a high level will come in, get a job in the sector, get PR within 2 years, and then actually go off and do something else? And is that a problem?
Look, I think there's always these potential unintended consequences. We saw in the past how we had a surplus of cooks and hairdressers because people worked out from overseas that was the quickest way to PR. And then we changed the list and changed the system, and then, you know, things changed in terms of people's migration choices. I think fundamentally, if there's a permanent labour need, skill shortage, it should be met through permanent migration. But the reason we've always been reluctant to do that, like to give aged care workers a permanent visa straight away, is this sort of concern that they'll just move. They'll start in aged care, the wages and conditions will be so poor that they'll move to something else. And then it'll just be this revolving door of people coming through. The Canadian Live-In Caregivers Scheme was a fast-tracked permanent residency scheme for Canada, and it saw the numbers of live-in caregivers just skyrocket over the period that it was introduced. So there are going to be challenges, but I think fundamentally the Aged Care Labour Agreement probably does strike the right balance in saying if you work in the sector for 2 years, you can then get a pathway to permanent residency. And I guess the hope is that by working in the sector and through unions being involved with employers on lifting standards in that sector and improving retention strategies in that sector, it will become less of a revolving door. And I think that is ultimately the harder work, but if we can achieve it in that sector, that would be a really good thing. I mean, in the ag space, I talk to lots of palm workers who work on great farms with great employers. They'd be really happy to come here, some on their 9th season, they'd be really happy to come here and live in that location and bring their family and just work on those farms all year round. They're not looking to change sectors.
Do we have any questions in the room? Over here. Thank you. Oh, the mic's just coming. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you. From Chartered Accountants Australia, and sorry, I'm wearing my mask, so hopefully you can hear me still. I'll try and put a couple of questions together. The first question is around how we improve employability and work readiness for international students. And that was particularly following the finding in Treasury's employment white paper that there are many international students and migrants coming in and they're not being placed in roles that actually match to their skills and qualifications. And that's particularly acute for accounting, say, and engineering. So that was one question. And I think a lot of the employers too happen to be small businesses as well. And that's where we're seeing a real pinch point. And I'm still not clear on what this review is going to do to help small businesses with all of these challenges as well, given complexities and costs. And I think particularly with the employer-sponsored visas and the fact that the state visas only have very limited places, say 5 per sector. So there's a bit in that it's really the international students' employability, work readiness, but particularly how we help small businesses through that and whether the migration system's ever going to work for them. Thank you.
Okay. So the first question, I was part of an Australian Research Council grant that went around to the university sector and looked at how they built employability in their students, and I particularly focused in the team on international students. And what we found is that, generally speaking, international students were not able to access the internships and work integrated learning programs that were available to local workers as much. So there was an issue about the fortnightly hours cap in the sense of how much work experience can an international student get in their degree before whether it counts to the cap or not. There's great ambiguity there that is an issue and it's a barrier. Secondly, these international students don't have the same networks to get those internships. Like mum and dad don't work at a law firm, they live in a different country, and so universities have to really step in terms of having targeted employability measures for international students. It should be a different offering and a better offering than what locals get, because they actually need that experience more. And then there's some visa issues in terms of if employers know that international students can only stay on that graduate study visa for 2 years or 3 years, they're less likely to hire them in those skilled roles, and so then international students go to the bottom of the pile. And so there's some key issues there that need to be addressed by government and the university sector working hand in hand around employability. the second question, which was on what is the review doing for small business. So I think fundamentally what we heard from small business was that the upfront costs are prohibitive, and so is the upfront red tape around employer-conducted labour market testing. So we recommended removing those upfront costs, so they were monthly rolling fees, and removing employer-conducted labour market testing. I think the SAF levy is an issue too. So understanding, and I think there is great mystery amongst employers about where does that money go for SAF, and I think
that's correct.
and I actually think that's problematic in terms of accountability and transparency in the system. And while we all generally agree that money should go to training local workers, if you don't know how it goes or where it goes, it can feel like you're just paying the money and giving it as a blank check to government or government, you know. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed for small business, in particular SAF. And then you know, so I think those are some of the things that the review suggests. But obviously, there are other, you know, in my horticultural work, again, in New Zealand, where small businesses, small farms, were locked out of the system like they are here with accessing palm, they've done things where they've created cooperatives where the small farms can group together and access the migration system that way. And so there are other things we can do here that would enable the system to be more accessible to small business.
Teresa, you've spoken about skills recognition, a few other pieces, but small business or other ways, other efficiencies you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think for small business, it is the program being just generally complex. So outside visa charges itself, the fact that, you know, there needs to be labour market testing when perhaps it's a kind of given, even the complexity of that, it's so prescriptive. If you don't get it right, you need to go back, do it again. It's just a lot of, I would just call it administration, which is probably unnecessary for small business. So that was just kind of one point there, but just in general, and on that point around students as well, and a lot of that is about certainty around your pathway and certainty for student population to permanent residency. So I think some of the changes around, you know, the short-term, medium-term, long-term lists, which are kind of ongoing, now people do have that pathway, I would hope would relieve a little bit of that, but there was a lot of decision making for students about what they should be studying that would give them the best prospect of being able to move to a permanent visa in the future as well.
So the top question I've got here now, I'm going to start with you, Teresa, because it sort of links to some comments that the Minister made and that we were sort of talking about in the context of the focus at the moment on the pressure that migrants are bringing to the economy. And so the question is really about whether the community has a good understanding of the economic benefits brought by migrants. It's certainly something that we've always had at the top of our list of messages to communicate. But the Minister sort of, I think, flagged that the role of business in being more proactive in advocating for this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Minister Giles mentioned, it really resonated with me because I think in the community, if I think about, you know, local government, state government and business, there's a really good understanding about, I'll just call it the net benefit of this, but within the wider community, probably not. But, you know, we are a strong business community and should be able to speak clearly around these things, similar to the referendum, where I think the legal profession really had an obligation to really try to also engage in that conversation from a very, you know, constitutional point of view. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot that business can do as well. I think, in this world of social media, it's just really difficult, and I think a lot of people find it difficult to communicate when if someone's frame of reference is what their social media feed is, and we know that social media feeds tend to just solidify bias of some sort, it's a really difficult way to try to get around that if they don't actually read the financial review or they don't read a report. They're looking at, you know, a 1 minute read on a, you know, Twitter or whatever. Like it's difficult. So I think it is a difficult ask as well. It's just a complex one, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't think many ordinary Australians are reading the Fin review, are they? So, I think, like particularly regional migration. One of the things that's interesting is you have a lot of people saying we do want the overseas workers because we know we need them, but then you also have that other factor of, but our infrastructure is not sufficient. Yeah. You know, our transport and our housing stock, and so governments absolutely need to be really getting in there and addressing those things so that we're not seeing migration as the reason for those problems.
Yeah, I think, and look, I'm going to try to thread through some comments here, which there's been a lot of questions around the labour agreements and aged care, and I think the points you're making, Joanna, like I think everyone has a vested interest in having a sustainable, stable system. And sitting beneath a lot of the problems have been various comments around what is essentially what we describe as a revolving door of policy. And it is complex policy, but a lot of the questions in here are just reflect that tension of trying to balance supply and demand, and how you get that sense of it and how you sort of communicate into the community, you know, what the system's trying to address, how it's reflecting these things and trying to get the balance right. And I mean, I find it so interesting because the conversations we're having with so many of our members is still can't get the skills. You know, whether it's infrastructure projects, whether it's energy transition projects, and they're looking to invest and support, basically, you know, creating more supply and greater productivity and enabling participation. And we know that the migrant numbers also follow a low unemployment rate, right? And so that it is a really complex issue, and there's a lot of moving parts. But I think the sense of a lot of the other comments coming through is, you know, how do we just get more visibility and predictability about supply and demand, and manage these in a way where it doesn't feel like we're just getting these sort of peaks and troughs. And I think, unfortunately, with COVID, we saw, you know, we've seen these massive dislocations, and that's what we're sort of, you know, I think the community is sort of responding to at the moment. And the big spike up is obviously getting a lot more visibility and a lot more attention. So I think the more that everyone can sort of try to be players in communicating the benefits and also just the importance of a sustainable system, that, you know, I think one of the comments I've been really pushing is that it's great the government's going to develop the strategy. We'll look forward to the release of that and the details soon. But it isn't going to be perfect, and so you know, we're really pushing as well for greater transparency, for data to be available so that everyone can have a look at it, so that there's more open conversation about it, and actually really encouraging the government to then make the changes it might need to on the way through if something isn't working, rather than launch a strategy and then say in 5 years' time, well, heck, that didn't work. So I think that's you know, where we're really going to be trying to continue to work with government to put the information out there to see how we can get things working efficiently, but always with a line of sight to actually being able to have some predictability about a system which has just been pretty volatile in its settings. Thank you so much for the questions again. We'll try to take those and digest them and get information back to members, in whether it's in the form of a blog or future research or a Q&A with the Minister, if we can. But can you join me in thanking our panellists? Thank you so much. Now, what we've got now for the audience is a short video, actually. We had hoped to have able to present to us his own personal story, Fadi Shalahe, who has come into Australia. He was born into statelessness, and endured a world devoid of rights and opportunities. He was labelled an illegal alien in Lebanon. Has faced persistent discrimination. It's a personal narrative which I think is very heartfelt and brings a very personal perspective to some of the rather academic conversations that we've been having. Fadi had really hoped to be with us, but for various reasons couldn't, and so he's very kindly recorded this video. So we'll watch that, and then afterwards it's time to break for lunch, and then we'll be back here for the afternoon session around about 12:30. Thank you.
Hey everyone. First of all, I want to start by expressing my sincere apologies. I really wanted to be there with you in person. However, due to last-minute work-related obligations, I couldn't be. In fact, as you are seeing this recording, I will be around 10 minutes away from you in Elizabeth Street hosting a work-related workshop. Now, that being said, please allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Fadi Shalouhi. I have a master's in finance. I am currently a senior manager for service improvement. However, for the majority of my life, I did not have these accolades. In fact, for the majority of my life, I did not even have a last name. And to explain why that was the case, I must take you back all the way to January 1990, where I was born in Lebanon to a Lebanese mother and a Syrian father. And 6 months after I was born, my father decided to leave. Now that wasn't the issue. There's single mothers everywhere. In fact, I truly believe that single mothers are the true Wonder Women of this world, and I have nothing but respect for them. However, that wasn't my problem. My problem was that in Lebanon, unfortunately until today, women are not allowed to register their children. Only men can. So my father wanted nothing to do with me, and on the other hand, my mother could not register me. So I was born stateless, and I remained stateless for the majority of my life. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term stateless, I want you to think of me as an alien. Because what else would you call someone who is not legally recognized as a human being or a citizen by any country on Earth? I might as well be from Mars. And unfortunately for me and every other stateless person out there, being stateless comes with a lot of legal ramifications and repercussions. Being stateless meant I had no access to education, no access to healthcare, no driver's license, no bank account, like I mentioned before, no last name, no legal presence or status or rights of any kind. In fact, if you had shot me in the streets of Beirut, you won't even go to jail because legally speaking, you did not shoot anyone. And the reason for that, Lebanon never signed any UN conventions on stateless people's rights. So from an international perspective, the country never made any legal obligations to take care or protect of people like me. And first question that potentially come to your mind is, well, how did you navigate this very complex environment? Well, the honest answer is I didn't. It was my mother who was doing all the navigation, so you probably should ask her. That being said, every single day was a challenge. And one of the first challenges that we met was education. How do you give a stateless person education? And just like every other challenge in my life, when everything was lost and it seemed like there is no hope and there is no way out of this problem, someone out of nowhere takes responsibility, jumps in, put their hands up and say, I'm willing to help you. In this case, it was a couple of nuns. My mother was the cleaner at the local Catholic school. So she just approached the head nun and said, please, all I want for my son is for him to learn how to read and write. Luckily, the nuns accepted. But they had to sneak into the classroom and hide. Because every time a public inspector would come, I did not exist. On the registry or on that piece of paper, the classroom had 20 children. I was child number 21. I was the only child of my generation that I knew of that was actually sneaking into a classroom instead of trying to sneak out. Probably didn't make me that popular in the playground. But I got access to free, illegal, high-quality education. The next hurdle was later on high school and university. Because in Lebanon, to go into that next stage of education, you need to pass a government-issued test. And I did not have the documentation to take the test, and I also was still being illegal. And the way around it was, again, a group of exceptional people. So the nuns introduced me to the Archbishop of North Lebanon. That's the second highest Catholic authority in the country. And as some of you might already know, Lebanon is heavily influenced by religion. So based on the fact I was a baptized Christian child, the son of a baptized Catholic Lebanese woman residing in Lebanon, the church issued a decree that basically allowed me to be granted access to educational facilities in high school and university. And that's how I eventually graduated with a master's degree in finance. Now, graduating was one thing, but finding a job was a completely different ballgame. Because at the end of the day, who in their right mind will hire an illegal stateless person, right? So you either needed to be extremely crazy or extremely rich that did not care about the law and did not care about any regulations. Luckily for me, I met a person who was both. One of our neighbors was working for this half French, half Lebanese CEO who basically had his own software company. He had several branches around the world. One of his branches was in Lebanon. And so after our neighbor shared my story with him, he said, well, I don't care about your last name, nationality, background. If you do a job, I'll pay you cash. I don't care. And that's exactly what he did. And I spent around 4.5, 5 years at his company. And the experience I got there was pivotal in helping me make my way to Australia several years down the road. However, there's a saying in my country that goes, it has to become worse before it becomes better. Probably butchered that in English. And that's exactly what happened to me. Because in 2016, I lost my mother to cancer. And with that, lost the last direct family I had alive. I was 25 and I woke up to a harsh reality. Mid-20s, stateless, no legal status, and no direct family and no future. And that really hit me hard. And after I processed that situation, I made myself and my recently deceased mother a promise. And I said, well, I was born stateless in Lebanon, and that wasn't my fault. But if I die stateless in Lebanon, well, that's on me. So I started looking for solutions overseas, asking questions, reaching out to embassies, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and eventually I came across TBB, or Talent Beyond Boundaries. Now I'll try not to steal TBB's thunder. I know Steph has a segment around that later on, and she is more than capable, and she is more passionate than me, and she can definitely paint a better picture. But what I can say about TBB is they help skilled refugees and stateless people who are stuck in the Middle East migrate through international employment. And what I loved more than their approach was the way they treated every single person in their talent hub and their talent pool. And if you ask every single candidate, not just me, they'll probably tell you the same answer. This is the best way and the best method to get people who are skilled across borders. Because you are giving us a chance to use our skills that we have earned through blood and sweat and tears to pay back the country and pay back this community that opened their arms to us and embraced us. You allow us to keep our pride, and you allow us to keep our dignity. Because no migrant, and I can guarantee that no migrant will be happy to come here and just sit and potentially be a liability. What Talent Beyond Boundaries do is help us achieve our potential, be productive, and give back to this community and this country that took us in. And that's exactly what they did. It wasn't easy, it was extremely complex. Now granted, I am a very exceptional case. I did not have a last name, no legal records, no birth certificate, no driver's license, no passport, nothing. So they had to build all of that from scratch. They had no documentation to work with. Yet despite all of these complexities and hurdles, Talent Beyond Boundaries, with the help of so many others, managed to get me over the line and legally fly me here to Australia in 2019. And ever since I came here, I felt nothing but love and welcome, and I felt included, and I couldn't have ended up in a better country even if I wanted to. So I'm extremely grateful. And what made things even better is in that first 6 months since coming to Australia, I've achieved more than I did in 28 years in Lebanon. And I know I am in Sydney, but when I talk achievements, no, I don't have an investment portfolio, unfortunately, like everyone tells me I need to have as a 32-year-old. But what I did achieve in 6 months was my first ever driver's license, my first ever bank account, my first ever paid vacation, and the list goes on and on. Small wins that a couple of years before that seemed virtually impossible, nothing but a dream. And at the moment, I am happily married, and I've met my wife the most Aussie way possible. Well, that's what I was told anyway, playing touch football. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. What Talent Beyond Boundaries did to me is going to impact all the future generations in my family for thousands of years to come. The positive impact that happened is exponential. Because 20, 30, 40 years down the line, 4, 5, 6 generations, they can all trace back their existence, and they can all trace back the fact that they are here and they are alive to one simple act of kindness. That a group of exceptional people looked at a stateless young man and said to themselves, the right thing for us to do is to help him find a place to call home. And this is exactly what I call Australia now, home. And I want to leave you with this beautiful saying by Goethe that I think really summarizes what TPP is all about. Look at the man the way that he is, and he only becomes worse. Look at him the way that he could be, and only then does he become what he should be. Down beyond boundaries, look at people's potential, the good in them, not their liabilities and not their problem. They help them overcome their problem so they can achieve their full potential. And I'm certain that if you are in this room and participating in this event, then your mind and your heart and your intentions are in the right place, and we are on the same page. So once again, sincere apologies I couldn't be with you, but looking forward to maybe catching up at a future event. Please feel free to reach out to me, get my contact details, drop me an email, a LinkedIn connect, whatever you want. I'm always happy to connect with like-minded people. Thank you again for listening. Hopefully you have an amazing rest of the day, and looking forward to catching up with you all personally in the future. Thank you so much.
My name's Andrew Barker. I'm a senior economist at CEDA, and I have the great privilege to be moderating a session today with Violet Remiliadis and Steph Cousins on harnessing our economic potential. But before we get on to that session, I'm going to set the scene a bit with some data analysis that we're doing at CEDA, showing how we're not harnessing the skills of migrants as well as we could be. This is work in progress that we're doing at CEDA using the ABS census data for 2016 and 2021. So it's, you're getting this hot off the press, and hopefully it sets the scene to set up a discussion with Violet and Steph about how we can potentially do things better. So the starting point is that we are focusing on hourly wages of recently arrived migrants from census data. There's obviously employment is very important as well. There's a lot of analysis around that, but we're focusing on wages as closely linked with productivity. We heard the importance from Minister Giles about productivity as the first objective in the reforms that are being made to the migration system. And so the upper blue line on this chart, what that shows is average wages for recently arrived migrants, those who arrived in the past 2 to 7 years, compared to the Australian-born population. So the recently arrived migrants earn less than the Australian-born population, particularly recently arrived female migrants, and that's got worse over the past 10 years between 2011 and 2021. And actually the situation's worse than this because migrants are relatively more educated than the Australian-born population, and this has a bigger effect than their lower English language ability and their younger age in terms of their wages. So the lower blue line that you can see is comparing like with like, so adjusting for the higher education, but lower on average English language ability, and we can see from that migrants on average earn about 10% less than equivalent similar Australian-born people. This analysis is for recent migrants. Migrants' wages do catch up after 10 or more years, which is consistent with other research, but that still means we're not making the best use of the migrants when they first arrive in Australia, and we estimate that this costs about $4 billion in foregone wages and therefore a loss in productivity for the Australian economy with costs for the migrants and for the Australian economy more broadly. So drilling down a little bit, these wage gaps are only partly explained by differences in characteristics. So this is a more detailed breakdown of the factors affecting female recently arrived migrants' wages, and broken up by education level. So at the left-hand end for people with just a school education, their lower wages for recently arrived migrants is fully explained by their lower English language ability on average. But at the right-hand side, it's a bit more worrying in a migration system that's very focused on bringing skills. more those who come in with postgraduate degrees. Those women are younger, which is associated with lower wages, particularly for highly skilled people. Wages peak later in life. And also English is even more important for more skilled migrants. Although they have better language ability on average, communication is even more important in high skilled jobs. And lower wages for these regions dominates the fact that migrants are more likely to settle in cities and to work in higher paying industries. And then even beyond that, we find that comparing like with like again, women with a postgraduate degree who've recently arrived in Australia as migrants earn 11% less than otherwise similar Australian-born people. So one of the important drivers of this can relate to qualifications recognition, and in fields like medicine, nursing, civil engineering, the trades, people need to be licensed to work in those occupations. We heard Teresa Liu talk about the barrier and the challenge that this can present for migrants. And so what this chart shows is on the left-hand side, this is wages of recent migrants versus the Australian-born population if they have education in a licensed field and they work in an occupation that's subject to licensing, and they earn about 10% less, consistent with the average across that whole migrant cohort. On the right-hand side, however, this is people who have education in a licensed field but are not working in an occupation subject to licensing, and those people earn more than 20% less than similar Australian-born people. So that they're, for example, people who can't get their qualifications recognised. Wages, of course, vary considerably by visa stream. This will be no surprise to any of you in this room, but I think the scale of the differences is probably revealing. Humanitarian and family visas, of course, serve broader social goals, so it's not surprising that wage outcomes are lower, and they also reflect lower English language ability, and particularly for humanitarian migrants, lower levels of education on average. But it's interesting looking at some of the other visa streams. So the Business Innovation and Investment Program, of course, does have an economic objective, but outcomes are relatively poor compared to other skilled visa streams, largely explained by the lower English language ability on average of people coming in under that stream. Outcomes for employer-sponsored migrants are very strong, reflecting the importance of that employer-employee matching, and also the importance of the skills that are really needed in our labour market. But we can also see a big gap in the outcomes for female versus male recent migrants. There's a 17 percentage point difference in their outcomes there. And part of the explanation, and this also came up in the discussion this morning, is around secondary applicants. So more than half of that gap in outcomes for employer-sponsored between male and female migrants is explained by secondary applicants earning considerably less. And there's a big gap in the male and female shares. So for women, 57% come in as secondary applicants across skilled visa streams in total, compared to men, it's only 27%. And so on the chart, we can see this is a comparison of secondary applicants versus primary applicants. Secondary applicants earn less because they are younger, less educated, work in industries that pay less, and also have slightly poorer English as well. And so that does raise some questions about whether we are making the best use of the skills we could get from secondary applicants. Joanna Howe mentioned that this morning as well. Raises some questions about whether we could better harness the skills we can bring in from secondary applicants. But this is sort of getting into policy and how we can better harness the economic potential of migrants. So I will now invite our panellists to come up. I'm very pleased to welcome Violet Remouliatis, the CEO of Settlement Services International, and Steph Cousins, the Global Co-CEO for Talent Beyond Boundaries. Thanks very much, Violet and Steph, for joining us today. I'd like to start with a question for you, Violet. So we know in March you co-hosted the Refugee and Migrant Skills and Jobs Summit, and then you did some work that you can also access on the tables about the potential $1 billion benefit from better using migrant skills. Can you tell us a bit about that work and what was so unusual about the process that led to that?
Thank you. Well, we all know that Australia is facing an unprecedented skill shortage. In some OECD countries, as we heard, their newcomers are less qualified than the wider population. And the opposite, though, is true in Australia. And yet, as we heard from you, refugees and migrants find it very difficult. There's significant barriers in finding meaningful employment, and they're very vulnerable to exploitation. So breaking down these barriers is a responsibility shared, we believe, by employers, not-for-profit organisations, unions, refugee-led organisations, and all levels of government. So we consulted 50 people or 50 experts from those sectors consulted 50 experts, but we also, more importantly, consulted refugees and migrants and incorporated their lived experience. What we identified, there were significant gaps, and there were 5 key recommendations that came out of those consultations. The first one is we must fix this broken skills and qualifications recognition system. Australia's current system is very bureaucratic, very complex, and very time-consuming. And that complexity not only stops refugees and migrants from engaging to the level that they should in terms of their skills, but it also stops opportunities to our economy. So within 1 year, you could add $5 billion to the economy if all refugees and migrants were working to the skill level that they had. The second is that we need to strengthen protections for migrant workers. It is a recipe for disaster and recipe for exploitation, really, if one person has the responsibility of both your paycheck and your visa. That's a key problem. The third, we must review the right to people. We must review the right to work for people on temporary visas. So holding people captive to the welfare system provides barriers for them later when they do want to get out and work. And also it does open the door for exploitation for many migrants and refugees if they can't actually engage in employment. The third point is we need to scale innovative tripartite partnerships. So partnerships amongst public, private and not-for-profits, where you can actually, place-based, find employment solutions and wrap around for refugees and migrants. And finally, we really do need to reform the English language requirements. Many industries, the requirements are far too high, really, for what's required. And that stops many people from working in the industries that they're skilled, and also, I think, provides less opportunities for many industries that we know at a critical level. Some of the key findings.
Thanks very much, Violet, for the quick summary of what I'm sure there's a lot more behind that. Before we get into the questions, maybe just to bring you into the conversation, Steph, can you explain a bit what Talent Beyond Boundaries does? And I think you've also developed a talent catalogue snapshot, which is relevant to some of the issues that we've been discussing as well. We've got that up on the screen.
So thanks so much for having me, and I think for all of you who are in the room when Fadi's video played, I think you've got a really good sense of the purpose of Talent Beyond Boundaries. Really, we are about working with displaced people, so refugees and stateless people who are still living displaced around the world, so Syrians living in Jordan, Palestinians living in Lebanon, stateless people living anywhere, but beyond the Middle East as well. So we're operating in Asia and Latin America as well to help refugees and displaced people migrate on the basis of their skills. And like for any businesses in the room, I think you would look at someone like Fadi and think, great talent, I would like to hire somebody like that. And it seems really obvious, but that's not our perception of a displaced person or a refugee. And it's also almost impossible to hire somebody in that situation that Fadi was in without some kind of accommodation in the visa system to enable them to actually migrate. So that's what we've been doing, is working with governments around the world that are willing to put in place these changes to their migration system that would provide a bit of flexibility for somebody who maybe doesn't have a passport, who doesn't have all of the documentation of their skills and qualifications, maybe who can't get a traditional police check because, you know, for example, an Afghan woman who's fled the Taliban, she's now in Pakistan, she can't go and get a police check from the Taliban right now. And I think anybody logically understands that, but actually the visa system we have doesn't allow that flexibility. So Australia was one of the pioneers in this place, and one of our co-founders is Australian, John Cameron, who really kind of kicked this off in Australia. And we've had really terrific leadership from the Department of Home Affairs to pilot what's now called the Skilled Refugee Labour Agreement pilot. What that does is provide a range of different concessions that do enable somebody who's got displacement-related barriers to come through the migration system on a permanent visa, which deals with a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about. And it's through the 186 visa, so it is an employer-sponsored visa program, but with concessions to enable them to come. And Australia is really, like I said, a pioneer, but not the only one in this space now. So we've got a very large program in Canada, which is also running a displaced talent program, and also the UK. And now in the last 12 months, we've opened up in Portugal, Ireland, Belgium, and the US. Next year, there's a bunch of European countries that are starting to do pilots as well, and really they're learning the lessons, I think, from Australia. But yeah, it's quite a unique, we're in a unique part of the migration system because it's still a bespoke pilot, like at the moment for 200 skilled refugees and their families over the next 12 months. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons though I think that we're learning through the pilot that could apply more broadly to the migration system and address some of the issues that we have talked about. So yeah.
That's a nice segue to speaking more broadly about the migration program. So there's one question here, sort of questioning whether lower wages for migrants are a problem if they catch up, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that migrants do catch up, and that's a fantastic success of the Australian migration system. But can you talk a bit about the barriers that you see to migrants best making the use of their skills, and what more could be done there to enable that? We'll start with you, Violet.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think the skills and qualification system, that process really works against people. When you think there's 34 authorities dealing with over 400 professions that people need to navigate, and that is far too complex. So we found that between 2006 and 2016, only 39% of newly arrived refugees and migrants who had post-school qualifications actually engaged with the system at all, because they just felt it was far too challenging, which means that many of those then work below their skill level, and again, and not in the careers, that they have trained and would like, have the aspiration to continue in Australia. And the other challenge and issue is, of course, in terms of English language testing, the IELTS, where people need a minimum of 7 for the 4 components: reading, writing, speaking, listening. And in many situations, you don't need to have that level to be able to actually do the job that you want to do. And many employers don't really want it either. We know that an Architect Institute is actually issuing letters saying that this person we have employed is speaking at the level that we're happy with, and they can do their job well. An example, the UK Council of Midwifery Nurses actually lowered the threshold for writing from 7 to 6.5, and they saw within 4 years a huge increase in productivity in health, in women working in that area, women and men working in that area. So that's a huge issue. And of course, the lifelong issue that we grapple with, I guess, as humans, racism and unconscious bias. We have to, acknowledge that. We were told, recruiters are told, don't send us people with names we can't pronounce, don't send us any more Indians. There's very much that attitude, unfortunately. And also unconscious bias, it is very much like asbestos. It's in the walls and ceiling. You can't really see it, but it's there, and it's very toxic.
Right, and perspectives from your cohort, Steph?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, and I think it happens even doubly so when people don't have on their CV a recognisable university or previous workplace, that there's just kind of nothing to anchor that. So you've got the unconscious bias, and then there's also nothing to anchor that person within a cultural context that we understand. So, and that really affects a lot of candidates here in Australia who've already made it, but also people offshore. I think on the licensing front, I very much agree with everything that Violet just said. There's also just embedded in each licensing system a bureaucracy and a set of administrative requirements that were not designed with the needs of refugees, displaced people, or really vulnerable people in mind. So let me give you an example. One is to become a registered nurse, you need to have proof of your previous registration. So we work with a lot of Palestinian nurses who studied very, very high quality nursing degrees and are doing excellently in the UK, by the way, because they have managed to figure this out. But through their degree would normally grant them the ability to be licensed to practice nursing in Lebanon. But because they're Palestinians and they're discriminated against, they cannot actually access that license. Yet hospitals will employ them as a normal nurse, they just won't indemnify them. So they work at their own risk, essentially, as experienced as any other nurses. Now, they can't provide and furnish proof of their previous licensing and registration. Therefore, they can't automatically pass through the normal, faster-tracked registration process in Australia. They may have to go back and do a nursing degree, can you believe it, because they can't have that piece of paper. And there's little things like that that I think we do need. It's going to take a lot of effort, actually, to resolve that, because the reason that rule exists is to protect the Australian community, and that makes a lot of sense, and we need to uphold that. But there are ways to be a bit more creative to reach the same standard, to prove the same standard of safety without needing that exact piece of paper. And that's what the NHS in the UK has done, like quite a lot of work mapping alternative ways to demonstrate with different documents the same standard. I think that's what we need, not just for nursing, but for every industry in Australia that requires licensing. And that would make a huge difference, because there's a lot of people who are working under their skill level because of licensing. But then I also think it's a bit of a penalty for not having local experience. It's just, and also you're in a weaker negotiating position as a migrant, particularly if you're negotiating a agreement offshore, and obviously you want your family to move to Australia. You're in not as strong a negotiating position as you would be, if you weren't in that circumstance. So, and once your salary starts lower, it kind of stays there. Well, it doesn't stay there, but you're always behind. Yeah. So I think it is incumbent upon, certainly at Talent Beyond Boundaries, we encourage candidates to negotiate. Some businesses find that like, are you kidding? This refugee is negotiating with me? Yes, they are, because then they would think that they can do better, and actually that's a good thing. And I think for all of us, businesses, governments, we should encourage that kind of activity, because that's also a way to elevate salaries.
I want to just bundle up the top couple of questions here. One of them builds on what you've been saying, but if you've got anything more to add, the question is, we've heard skills and qualification recognition's a challenge. Are industry bodies setting the bar too high? And if so, what can we do about it? And then the second question is a specific example around DUA's Pilot 2 to provide free skills assessment to migrants, whether you've been involved in that and whether you think that's working or moving in the right direction. Start with you again, Violet.
Yes, we have been involved. We referred many people to it, and they're very thankful and would have loved it to be extended. We've been doing quite a bit of work with the department. We held a roundtable, indeed, where there were 7 or 8 people who'd experience who spoke to the department and the particular unit and the Minister's office as to the end-to-end in terms of their experience from arriving until getting the job that they wanted. What they spoke to was some of the things that both Steph and I have raised and you spoke to about qualification recognition and blocks from employers in many ways. But it was also what was successful. They spoke to the fact that having a navigator type program that also supports them through the human service system and helps them navigate to be able to negotiate the recognition skills system and to work with employers, for example, and get them ready is what actually supported them. So you had people who were trained engineers who were actually working as engineers, and some of them in a very quick period of time. So there is a lot of hope that with putting in things where you're sort of contributing towards the cost of the testing, which can be very onerous, that is a big issue. And also finding where you can have one place, like a one-stop shop, where people can actually look at how can they work through and test to see, have I got a good chance of being recognised or getting a licence. And Germany, for example, does that very well. They've got a multilingual one-stop shop portal, and they've seen a doubling of recognition of qualifications in 4 years. So lots of opportunities there.
Yeah. We haven't been involved in the pilot that you mentioned, but we have been involved in a similar initiative in Canada, which provides funding for people to access the training or requal or testing they require for licensing. And it's such a no-brainer. I mean, it's a great investment, and a lot of our candidates use it and are able to get licenses as a result. But for unlicensed professions, I would say, I mean, in our experience, and certainly this is what employers tell us, but I think this is our experience too, because we've started to see candidates who've been here for 4 years and they're moving on in their careers and having lots of promotions and moving to the next thing. Fadi being an example, he started at Accenture, which I'll mention because I know Accenture's here, I think, but he's now in another senior job. Employers are the best determinants of whether a candidate has the skill required for the job. Like, they're literally the ones who are like grilling the candidate on whether they can do the job, and they've got the expertise. And for our program, it's a matching program. So any candidate that comes in through the visa has been matched with an employer. The employer has tested them, and that gives them their local experience. Like, they come in with a job, they've got local experience, and from that point onwards, there's no skills assessment kind of required really, because you've got that kind of benefit of local experience. And I think, so for our program, we don't have a skills assessment requirement, even though it's a 186 visa, which normally requires it. That job has been put on the employer. The employer's job is to assess the skills, not a skills assessing body, unless it's a licensed profession. And that's actually, it's working really well, and I think is a testament to businesses really are not going to put a lot of money into hiring somebody if they haven't tested that the person can do the job.
Positive there. Specifically, there's a question on humanitarian visas in particular, and what more can government do to harness the potential of humanitarian visa holders? If you want to start, Steph.
Yeah, well, interestingly, our program uses skilled visas. So, I mean, I think a lot of the same strategies apply, though, around licensing, for sure. But we actually don't work in this is like possibly a misconception. We don't work in the humanitarian visa space. We work in the skilled visa space. And the reason that's important is because it's additional to the humanitarian program. And really, ideally, we make the whole skilled program as accessible to anybody, whether they're displaced or not, as possible, and you'd get a lot more refugees. You'd free up a lot of spaces in the humanitarian program, perhaps. But I mean, I feel like you're definitely the expert on this, because there's a whole range of challenges if you come in without English or without,
Many humanitarian entrants, refugees arrive, they've got a whole life experience, and they come with many strengths and skills and qualifications. Many have run businesses, so it is really about tapping into that as early as possible when people arrive, and not wait for a long period of time. At this stage, for the first 12 months, refugees, humanitarian entrants don't actually engage with Workforce Australia. Within that time, settlement services work with them and in collaboration with other employment services and programs to actually really quickly understand their aspiration and experiences and what they want. There's a program in New South Wales called the Refugee Employment Support Program, and that actually engages with people and looking at a plan that looks at language and education, vocation, qualification, and that plan is really about walking them through at the step that they need and want, because some people are ready to work straight away and others, are not. But importantly, also engaging with employers. And there are many, many employers. When we had at the height of the Syrian war, when we had an extra cohort of 12,000 arrive, for example, we worked with Allianz Insurance, and they set up, what was interesting and really good was permanent positions. And 33 people, refugees and humanitarian entrants, actually ended working with Allianz. We provided, as a settlement provider, support around pre-employment, getting job ready, mentoring pre and post being employed. But the employer really stepped up too. They did English language, industry-specific vocational language, and a range of different activities in the workplace to integrate both the new refugee employees, but also for their own staff. And more recently, we're launching next week at the Australian Computer Society that has 47,000 members, a guide for tech employers. And but a lot of the tips, I guess, would be relevant for many employers, which is piloting learn as you earn programs, which work really well. So people, as Steph was saying, on the job, they get that local work experience, and asking employers to value work experience people have, irrelevant of where they may have gained it. And also looking at embedding culturally and inclusive work practices and recruitment practices. So if you really want to bring in refugees and humanitarians into your workplace, really target, have a campaign and target, and advertise in a way that's going to be appropriate. And really implement fit-for-purpose language assessments, as Steph was saying, that is relevant to your workplace, and not having that bar so high that might exclude people from doing what they can do.
Thanks very much. We are basically out of time, but I want to finish with one question, and a positive one. And there's a perfect question here about if you can tell us about briefly a success story that you've had, even when the system might have been working against you.
I feel like every case that we've brought to Australia has been that, because all of them have had Fadi was the first stateless person that we brought out, and that was a whole lot of, specific kind of issues to do with statelessness. I think probably I found your presentation really interesting, just the gender disparity actually in results. And I actually want to talk about some of the spouses that have come. We do have a major disproportionate number of men as primary applicants, similar to the whole program. It's about 34% women, I think, primary applicants, and so it's a little bit more gender balanced, but still we have that. One of the really wonderful things I've noticed is starting to see the spouses in the workplace, like finishing courses. We have one, we actually helped a doctor to migrate to Australia, a Syrian doctor who got his licence to operate within a year, actually, full licence to operate, and everybody said that was not going to be possible, but actually had an extremely good, there's a lot of unconscious bias in those perceptions as well, but he definitely overcame those and is working as a doctor. But his wife is now a fully qualified pharmacist as well, and doing just as well as he is, really kicking goals. So I think that it's the whole family, isn't it? It's not just the primary applicant, which is what we always focus on in the migration space. Yeah.
Fantastic.
One example I give is we have a social enterprise called Work and Stay, and there was a young man who arrived, and within a trained engineer from his country of origin, from Iraq, and within a week of arriving, He said that he was very interested in working as an engineer, and he was happy to go into regional or rural Australia to do it. And we're working with 34 regional councils in New South Wales and Victoria that are desperate for professionals like Malik, this man. And he applied, he was interviewed, and within a month he had a job as an engineer in a regional council, and he moved, and he's sort of laying roots there. And I also wanted to talk very quickly about entrepreneurship and many refugees and humanitarian entrants who arrive and start up their own businesses. And you know, we have wonderful colleagues here who themselves have initiated many startups, and one of the programs we run, Ignite, but there's many others, has supported over 400 people to start up their own businesses. So some are small, like sole traders, but some, like Hediat, you know, in construction, is employing, you know, dozens of people. So there's many, many good news stories, which tells you about the spirit of those who arrive with aspiration, who really are grateful and know that they are going to be great contributors and do it in any way they can.
Yeah, we shouldn't lose sight of those positive stories and the human dimension of that. I really need to draw it to a close, and I'd like to invite you to join with me in thanking Violet and Steph for their contributions. And now I'd like to invite Ming Long AM for the next panel session on welcoming Australians.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello. I can speak louder than the thing if that's helpful. Oh, good, says Amitabh. We're just going to jump right into it. This is the panel for attracting skills and talent to Australia. We just heard about some of the challenges that that migrants actually have. My name is Ming Long, and I have the privilege of being on the board of CEDA. You can Google everything else that I get up to, but I do want to introduce the participants. Their biographies are long and they're in the app, so I'm not going to read all of it, but go and have a look at the experience that they bring to this panel. We have Andrew Kincaid, who's the Managing Director for Bupa Villages and Aged Care. We have, hopefully, is Jane online? Hello, Jane, there you are.
I am. Hello.
Jane McMaster, who's the Chief Engineer at Engineers Australia. And we have Amitabh Mall, who's the Chief Analytics Officer at Woolworths Group. You have obviously been here the whole day. You know you can ask questions in the audience. If you want to ask a question, please put up your hand and a microphone will come to you. But I think most people are using the Pigeonhole app. So I would jump in straight away and don't wait for me to ask for questions, because I will have them with me the whole time, and I'll try and weave in those questions into some of the prepared questions that I have. We have three experts here on attracting talents and skills to Australia, and Australia's global reputation matters to attracting these people to our country. We've heard from the previous panel that we have barriers, including racism, because it is absolutely alive and well in this country. And this is both social as well as recognition of skills and education. And with the shortages that we see in many other countries as well, how we show up globally and how we provide pathways to help migrants integrate their skills and talents into Australia matters. So Amitabh, can I start with you? Woolworths is the largest employer in Australia, with a workforce spanning many occupations and skills. How does migration fit into your talent sourcing strategy?
Before I answer that, if that's all right, Ming, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I'm a very proud migrant into the country myself, having moved into Australia 5 years ago, one of the 6 million that Minister Giles referred to, who are hoping to build their life in Australia since the time it started. As far as Woolworths Group is concerned, as you pointed out, we are the largest employer, private sector employer in the country. 186,000 people at current count, spread over 1,250 locations. So not only is it a very large number, it's also a very spread out number. We work in the communities that we serve, which makes us quite special, as when it comes to people who come to Australia, it's one of the first ports of call is shopping at the local Woolies, and for many, actually jobs in the local Woolworths or in the local Big W. Of the 186,000 people, we have about 20,000 who are on visas, and about a fifth of them are on student visas. So migration is actually quite a material part of how we think about talent in our business. And that's when we're talking about the scale numbers of serving Australians and meeting the food and everyday needs of all Australians. Then there is a second side to it, which is Woolworths as a technology business, which is not how normally you would think about Woolies, but we do have more than 1,000 technology and computer software, software engineers. We have more than 1,000 people in the data governance analytics space, several hundred in the cybersecurity space, which is so, critical. So, and that's the second part of what we do, which is it takes a lot of technology to run a large retailer, and making sure that we have the right skill sets. And we do benchmark with the best in the world as a business, which means we do want to make sure that we have the best in the world when it comes to talent. So quite an important part of our strategy overall.
Is it hard, like in the global landscape, right? You put Australia in with so many other countries that are trying to attract that top talent. How do we show up for that technology side?
It is both hard and easy at the same time. I would say the easy bit is, there is a certain attraction to the lifestyle in Australia that does attract people, that does make them interested. But at the end of the day, there is a physical reality. It's very far away from most parts of the world. Yes. And in particular during COVID, we did see actually quite a bit of people who came and worked with us from different parts of the world actually chose to go back to be closer to family and friends. So there is both the positive and the negative of where we are as a country. But in general, people do appreciate the lifestyle. It's the process and what kind of skill sets, how quickly can we do it. And there was a lot of conversation earlier today about a lot of improvements that we're trying to make. And I think it feels like it's all headed in the right direction.
Okay, fingers crossed. Andrew, can I come to you next? Just a question for the audience, if you can put up your hand. Who has parents who are ageing that need help today or in the next 5 years? I have a mum who, if I can get beyond her stubbornness, would be in more care, right? Andrew, with this ageing population, and we are all imminently interested in your answer here. How prepared are we as an Australian ageing population to the increasing demand in your sector? Do we have the workforce to meet this without migration?
So, no is the short answer, Ming. So thank you for the question, and it's very similar themes to Avatar just described in retail. So we employ about 7,000 people as Bupa. We're one of the largest providers and the largest regional provider. And everything you read about healthcare workforce shortage, it's far more severe and far more acute in regional Australia, and I'll come back to that. But the challenge of a healthcare workforce shortage is one we're seeing across many Western countries at the moment. And so everyone's, literally got the same challenge. So I think on CEDA's own figures, we've got a significant shortfall today, and that's only going to increase. So, I guess the people that raise their hands, the first baby boomers are only going to really need residential care, and it is a need, it's not a want, in the next 5 to 7 years. So the shortage we have today only gets bigger. And already today, about 40% of our sector workforce, so we employ about 250,000 people as a sector, 40% today are born overseas. And so it's a sector essentially that would collapse without migration, and that need only increases going forward.
Jane, can I come to you next? So 62%, I have a stat here, of Australia's qualified engineers are born overseas. How are we positioning ourselves to attract and retain the top tier talent we need? And everybody wants these engineers too, I might say. And what sort of visa and migration incentives are being considered to grow the demand, to meet the growing demand for these skills? And is there a specific focus around clean energy skills? Because see, there's a great report around the skills we need in this transition. So is there additional focus around clean energy skills we need to transition to sustainable energy?
Yeah, look, thanks, Ming, for the question, and hopefully you can all hear me all right with my audio here. So let's just focus on that statistic. First of all, 62% of the engineering workforce in Australia are made up of our overseas-born engineers. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes. Yep, great. And that's been the case for a long time. Australia has relied on our skilled migrant engineers for well over 10 years, and that will continue to be the case for many years to come. So it's incredibly important that we nurture that part of our engineering workforce. Yes, absolutely. I think the visa and migration programs should consider being more sector and industry focused and specific and tailoring the system to meet the demands for that. But I will point out that the workforce challenges within engineering span more than just the clean energy sector, as important as that is. We are finding that sectors are competing with other sectors for engineering talent. States are competing with other states. And as you've pointed out several times, Australia's competing with other countries. We do have an incredible lifestyle over here, and that works in our favour. But I think the immigration and visa system, needs to be workable as well. And I suppose one of the key things for engineers in particular is that we don't have great employment outcomes for our skilled migrant engineers. Only around half, 50% of skilled migrant engineers who come to Australia actually work in engineering roles. So one of the key points Engineers Australia has been talking about over the last couple of years is that when we bring our skilled migrant engineers into Australia, we need to support them better in helping them to find engineering work. And in the last panel spoke about a lot of the barriers to workforce participation for engineers when they arrive in Australia. So we need to be looking at a whole range of things.
So Jane, if I can just stay with you around that point, it feels like we can fix all the systems, that, the minister can do certain things, we can put in place pathways, but it sort of feels like there is also something as a society, as a community, as a country, ourselves, without the migrants there necessarily, we need to have a look at ourselves and work on ways to be more inclusive of these people sort of coming and to recognise that they have amazing skills. We heard that stat before in the previous panel, that some of them are actually more educated than Australians in country. How do you... I mean, it sort of feels like the discussion around migrants is actually not about the migrants, it's about us as a country.
Look, absolutely. And a few other speakers have spoken about cognitive bias. It's a really multifaceted problem, though. We released a report a couple of years ago called Workforce Participation for Skilled Migrants, and it identified 7 main barriers to employing skilled migrant engineers in engineering roles. And they cover a few things: uncertainty and confusion about the visa and immigration system, uncertainty about that registration requirement and qualifications. But there's also the social and employer-related aspects. Cognitive biases comes into it, a perception that communication skills aren't always as good as they need to be. But there's so much that can be done, and we hear all the time of skilled migrant engineers who, as you say, are so highly qualified and have incredible levels of experience, but there's something about the recruitment and onboarding process that makes that more difficult than it should be. So we too have plans to put in place a guideline for engineering industry to make workplaces more inclusive for skilled migrants. A lot of workplaces think it's the first 6 months that's the most challenging to help people who've come from overseas to feel settled in a new workplace. And there's a lot that workplaces can do to provide that supportive and inclusive workplace. So we're pulling together a guideline that draws on best practice and lessons learned and share that more broadly across engineering organisations.
Yep. Now, Andrew, I'm going to the pigeonhole out because, like I said, we don't have a huge amount of time. I'm going to come to you next. There's a question for you. Is Bupa signed up to the aged care labour agreement? Do you think the tripartite model is a good one for helping skilled but low-wage workers into sectors with skills shortages?
Thanks, Ming. No, so no, we're not. So I think you heard from the Minister, everyone heard from the Minister this morning, and there's about 20 agreements that have been signed. That as a figure is good and encouraging, but that's 20 out of about 2,500 providers. So for anyone with a calculator in the room or without, that's not a great figure. I think, as always, there's been a bunch of things that the government have done in recent times that have been tremendous and well-intended. But as other panellists have spoken about, as Violet touched on in the previous panel, other countries have really lifted their game. So the equivalent agreement in Canada is quick, straightforward, low cost. I was in the UK recently and staggered by the number of recently arrived nurses from the Philippines and India and other Asian countries in the UK. And if you're a nurse in Manila right now, weighing up, which plane do I get on? It costs you $10,000 more to come to Australia and more time than it does to go to the UK. The German government have people in Manila right now teaching German to local nurses to bring people back to Germany. So we've done some good things, but unfortunately everyone else has lifted their game and we're getting left behind.
If I can go to you next, Amitabh, what initiatives have you implemented or recommended not only to attract migrant workers, but also to retain them long term?
I think it's two-parted. On the attraction side, just looking at the different pools that we have, and there's been a lot of conversation about refugees, and we've been quite active in that space as well. Over the last year or so, we've had a refugee employment program that has brought in more than 300 people into employment, giving them, teaching them skills and making them employable, both as a short term to earn a good living in their local community, but also potentially, frankly, just give them confidence to operate in the community that they work in. And in the tech space that I talked about earlier, much smaller program where, just to back Jane's point, the first 6 months are quite important. So we've had a refugee cadetship program where we've brought in people, and 30 odd people in 3 cohorts have gone through it, where for this first 6 months, it's an internship. And then depending on how they land, they have an opportunity to apply for full-time roles. And quite a few of them have, and many of them have been successful. So there is a fair bit going on. I guess the challenge is it's still in the context of the country, in the context of overall migration, these are still relatively small numbers. The question is, how do we move the dial? And to Andrew's point, how do we make Australia a more competitive opportunity that people want to come to? Like I said earlier, there is a certain attraction to the lifestyle that we already have. There's a natural strength we have, but are we doing enough to mitigate some of the other challenges that people face?
Yep. Can I just throw both of you into the hot seat again, right? Housing. It is such, it's like, honestly, you talk about it and it's this nerve you touch both. This is where I'm contrasting again the discussion around migration, housing when it's just us, and then there's a discussion around housing which includes migrants, and it's almost like we want all these people to come here because they're all critical to us, but we don't care about, sort of the housing shortages that we have, because we only care about that for ourselves. Now, you guys have actually done a few things around housing. Do you want to talk about that? Because it is such a nervy issue, and how it's portrayed in the media can create this divide between, it's like this them and us.
Happy to start and I'll start by saying that I'm definitely no expert on the topic. Many others today have spoken about it. Actually, I thought a point that Dr. Ho made earlier in the day, I found it quite, relevant, which is housing really the outcome of immigration? Is just shining a spotlight on a challenge that we already have. But people like Dr. Ho and far more knowledgeable people can speak to that.
And it's not just housing in the end, right? It sort of morphs into all the infrastructure required actually to service our country. Right? So
for us, the part that we are trying to do is mixed-use developments, where there is clearly a greater densification in urban areas. It's a natural flow that's happening. And one of the ways that we are, which means there is a need for a lot of retail services that we provide, but what we are finding is often just retail services is not enough. So participating quite actively, whether it's the Waterloo development that we are undertaking with the City of Sydney to spend $200 million for a mixed-use development, which is not just solving for the retail needs of the community, but also potentially housing needs of the community. So again, all the steps, the question is skill and speed.
Yeah, and similar to Amitabh's comments and the Woolies approach. So again, I'll declare I'm not an expert, but I agree it's not a simple kind of cause and effect, and obviously migration is potentially a solution to, with the right sort of skills, actually increasing our capacity to develop housing. But certainly as we experience it, and as I mentioned, it's the largest regional provider, we have certain pockets where the housing shortage is quite acute. And our approach there has been actually, just even last week in northern New South Wales, we've converted what were previously resident accommodation to accommodation for newly arrived migrants. So rather than adding to all the existing delays in terms of sort of onboarding, we've said actually no, we'll set you up with free accommodation at no cost for you and your family, while we then help you settle in on board and find somewhere to live in the community. And that's been fabulous. And obviously having existing communities of people who've arrived from Philippines, Nepal, India, as part of that settlement is obviously tremendous as well. But again, we've done that, I think, similar to the work Willie's been doing on our own, with no support in that instance from government. But there's certainly the conversations we're having with various governments at the moment that we'd love to take that further and really, again, having similar to the Wurundjeri, that opportunity for essential services such as aged care, childcare in areas of housing shortage, combined with affordable housing, it solves a number of problems at once.
So live where you work, no commutes, fabulous, except you can't get away from work. I'll just point that out. I have another question here. If I can come to you, Jane, because it was interesting. I mean, you would be, a minority, as a female engineer in the workforce, you are so precious because you're in the minority in that sense already, right? Then we're trying to attract global engineers to Australia. I'm presuming around the world there is a similar sort of gender gap in engineers around the world. You can correct me, or you can, I'm sure there is a stat that may counteract that. But then on top of that, making sure we're attracting as much female engineers to Australia as much as male engineers, how do you think we should ensure that the workforce, this is a question, is inclusive and accommodating of culturally and racially marginalised people? What practices have you seen that has been the most effective, especially when you're talking about the first critical 6 months?
Yes, okay. Let me first go to the stats and then I'll come to the effective program. So we've just actually recently crunched the 2021 census data, and it shows that Australian-born women make up only 3.8% of qualified engineers in Australia, and actually overseas-born women make up around 12% of the engineering workforce. So there are more overseas-born women engineers in Australia than Australian-born women by a long way. But the unemployment rates for overseas-born women engineers are much higher than for any other gender engineering category. So that's something that we need to be mindful of. In terms of the gender split in other countries, some other countries are doing a great job. India, Pakistan, some South American countries, Germany, are almost at gender parity and have been for some time. So they're doing a lot better than Australia. And there's a cultural reason for that for engineering. Engineering as a profession just doesn't have as much of a reputation, is not as highly regarded as it is in some countries where it's considered with equivalent esteem as doctors and lawyers, for example, how they might be considered here. So other countries are doing things differently, and we're always looking to other countries to learn. It's very hard to change a culture overnight, but we're always looking to other countries to understand how can we raise the awareness of engineering profession in this country, and absolutely how do we lift that gender split. Coming to your point about what programs work, there's a couple of really good examples that we hear from our members. One of them has introduced a 6-month program for both women and people from other sort of minority groups, as I mentioned before, to ensure that the organisation provides inclusive and supportive workplaces, and that's especially for the first 6 months for our overseas-born engineers, but for women engineers it extends over the entire sort of career continuum, and should address things like career How do we retain our women engineers in the engineering workforce, because they do tend to leave at various points of the leaky pipeline that we tend to call it. The other practical initiatives that we've seen work are one of our own. Engineers Australia runs a program that's in pilot phase at the moment called the Global Engineering Talent Program. So we're taking cohorts of skilled migrant engineers and link them up with industry employers to provide internship opportunities, to provide networking opportunities, because we find that's one of the highest barriers. Just no local networks, and engineering employers do tend to hire from their networks and who they know. So we provide those networking and internship opportunities, and also workshops on how to write CVs in the Australian context, how to do interviews in the Australian context. And one other good example that I'll cite is a program for refugee engineers in Victoria called EPIC, which is associated with Major Roads Projects Victoria. And again, that takes in cohorts of refugees and has a study and learning component to it, which provides the refugee engineers with a qualification and much needed experience to kickstart their careers as engineers.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now, I've got another question here, and there is an inherent bias in it, but I'll read it out to you. How can we base migration around skills and experiences of people before they arrive to Australia? And I love that question because, you know, I've been in another professional association board where it seemed like if you had skills and experiences from an Anglo country, it was equivalent to Australia. But where it wasn't, every other qualification was seen as inferior, and why should we allow them into our country and almost dilute our skill set? I love that question because it is actually valuing the experience that they bring from before as equivalent or even better in many times, you know, in circumstances, especially when we're talking about English as a language, which implies, yes, that we need them to speak English in Australia, but it also implies that they are multilingual, and there's not many of us in Australia that are multilingual, which is an asset, I would have thought. I'm not multilingual, so, you know, it's just that inherent bias that we have in the country. Can I just ask that question to the three of you? How can we base our migration around, you know, around the skills and experiences of people before they get here?
So I think, thank you, Ming. I think I know for all the economists in the room, healthcare historically hasn't had a great reputation at this, as in on top of all the government sort of processes, there's the various colleges, and obviously there have been various reviews over the years around kind of cartel-like behaviour for kind of keeping people out. I think that is changing. Obviously, it changes at a slower pace in healthcare than it probably would change in other sectors. But certainly, to the question, you know, from our perspective, one of our best channels is referral by existing team members. So when we've had someone who has worked with someone in a hospital in the Philippines, in India, in Nepal, who's recommending this person, who's got other connections, etc., then we're actually, you know, essentially, you know, and obviously working with partner agencies, looking at that candidate as a trusted referral, rather than, you know, as we may have done in the past, where we didn't have all of those sort of data points. So I think aged care has probably moved, you know, beyond where it was a few years ago. But still further to go.
Can I just stay with you for a second though, because there's a lot of things I talk about within the corporate where I'll talk about, I can teach a person the technical skills, you know, do this is the process, etc. I can't necessarily teach them how to care. And in your sector, it's almost like you want to hire the care gene, because it's inherent in who they are. Yes. That's hard to teach, that you think like, versus the technical side?
It's not even a consideration, as in it's impossible to teach. So I agree, we hire for attitude and values.
Yep.
Like everything else is teachable, secondary, as you say. And that's why I think, just to expand on my earlier comments, the trusted referral is not just this person was good at dressing a wound at the local hospital. Actually, good people know good people, and therefore, you know, we're far more likely to see, you know, right values, right attitudes, etc., and people who are coming to us via referral from our recently arrived sort of team members.
Yep. Yep, Amitabh, can I come to you?
I think having worked in 3 continents in my career, I feel the challenge.
I love that.
Of calibration.
And you came here.
I told you the lifestyle.
Yes.
But it's the calibration. And if your question is about before they get here, I do think professional services, agencies as well as associations actually play a big role in the calibration, whether it comes to things like accountants, engineers, technologists. How do we calibrate to make sure that the ranking, the rating, and so on is where if someone studied at a particular kind of university in a particular country, we may not know of it, but there is a calibration. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I'm hoping that it's something that we can keep getting better at over a period of time. Once they're here, I think exactly what Andrew said. It's about referrals, it's about opportunities to test and learn. So it's not a one shot at it and nothing after that, but you try, and it gives us a chance to calibrate the individual, which is why programs like internships are so valuable.
Yep. Jane, can I come to you on that question? And can I just throw in one other piece that makes it harder for you? Because when they get here and say we value them and they're fabulous, they don't have a network in Australia to be able to, get to a position where, imagine if I am a migrant coming to Australia, you don't just have aspirations for your first job, you have aspirations for your career. But they come here, great, we value their previous experience, but they have no network. They have no connections to get them into that career ladder.
Oh, couldn't agree with you more. And that was one of the key findings from our research. It's that lack of a local network just to get their foot in the door. But then, as you say, to grow their network and further their career, which is why it's one of the key areas of focus of our Global Engineering Talent Program is providing those networking and internship opportunities, which just helps that network start to grow. In terms of mobility between countries, what can we do before people come here? Well, I think there's a couple of things. So firstly, one of the barriers seems to be queries about qualifications and certifications. And I'm not sure if it's correct to say that people think that qualifications they're not familiar with are inferior. It's probably more of a question of, I don't know. And in a profession like engineering, it matters if someone's well qualified or not. So there's 2 things there. So firstly, Australia, through Engineers Australia, is a member of the International Engineering Alliance. And one of their key objectives is international mobility for engineers. Now, 2/3 of the world's population is represented through the membership of the IEA. And the IEA has what we call international agreement pathways that allow for, in theory, the smooth flow of engineers across the globe through those membership countries. But what we need to get better at doing, the members need to get better at doing, is raising awareness of those pathways and improving the systems that actually support an engineer in India or Pakistan to come to Australia, for example, using those international agreement pathways. They have, as Amitabh was saying, we have pre-vetted the qualifications, many of the qualifications from those countries. The second part to that is all the qualifications which haven't been pre-vetted. I think there is a role for professional associations such as ours, Engineers Australia, to provide a service that can provide some guidance on, if it hasn't been pre-vetted through the IEA, can we provide some guidance on how equivalent it is? And we are actively looking at how we can provide that service and just make it less confusing for employers.
Yep. Now, we've completely run the time, so Melinda's going to give me daggers eyes, look at me with daggers at the moment. But if we can just finish it there, but it's been very interesting. So I said, having a conversation about migration, we're so good at focusing on the overseas and the pathways sort of coming here, but we as a country who are already, with the people here already, we actually have quite a lot of work to do ourselves. It's not just leaving it to government, it's not just leaving it to other people to solve the pathways. There's a lot that we have to do ourselves, both from a social and economic, we've heard from the previous panel, but also in that recognition piece, because I completely agree with you. There'll be, there's equivalence if we take bias out of it. But if I haven't heard of that university, I'll think of it as riskier, even though someone's told me it's equivalent, just because I haven't heard of it. It's human nature. Our biases are such that we will gravitate to what we know and what we don't. So look, thank you so much for everyone's input into this and into this panel. This is something that, as I said, it's not just leaving it to other people to work. I certainly encourage you to read CEDA's research in this. The team's been doing research into migration over a long period of time. This is not something that is a short-term fix. I'm sure there are low-hanging fruit that we can deal with, but this has to be a long-term fix for our country. But thank you very much to the panellists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ming. I was prepared to let you go for a little bit longer, possibly because you are my boss. Or one of them, I should say. Well, thanks everyone for being with us again. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation and some really powerful themes that have come through, and I'm going to reiterate a few of them, including the one that Ming was just making. What are some of my takeouts? For starters, we started with the Minister, and the Minister referenced the fact that he'd spoke here at our conference last year. And I think that's actually a really important thing to call out. We have a government, I think, that is serious about sustainably improving migration. They undertook a review. They undertook a review with serious people on the panel, and those three members took it very seriously and delivered a pretty comprehensive report. The government's responded to it in terms of its outline of the things that it thinks is important and the 5 key principles that are going to guide its strategy. And the government has committed to releasing its strategy prior to the end of the year. So all of that, I think, is really worth actually acknowledging and acknowledging as a positive development. Anyone who's been in this space knows, as I said earlier, that policy has been an absolute revolving door in this space for so long, and I've been involved in migration off and on for a long time, and I can give you a little anecdote from many years ago where I actually sat on an expert panel review that was tasked with looking how to improve the efficiency of the then 457 visa, and before we'd even handed in the review, there was another one that was announced that was looking at how to strengthen the integrity of the 457 visa. So if we can actually land on a strategy that has broad support, that is heading in the right direction, I think that is a very, very positive development. I can say also that we might not agree with everything that will be in the strategy, but my experience and that of CEDA has been that the government is consulting. It is looking to hear from people about what is and isn't working and to hear their ideas for how to make the system better. So again, I think that is very much worth acknowledging. What else would I highlight? I started by saying that migration has been and will continue to be a really important driver of our economy, our economic success, and that is absolutely true. But it is also a key driver of the broader way in which we live in this country and the broader strengths of this country and our social fabric. We talked a little bit about some of the pressures that are building at the moment, some of the public commentary around cost of living pressures and housing pressures. One of the things that I was sort of doing, multitasking a bit myself, I wanted to have a look at the Scanlon mapping social cohesion data for this year. And it's just a bit of a reminder that, yes, this is a hot button topic at the moment, but according to that survey, which has a long track record, 89% of Australians think that multiculturalism is good for Australia, and that hasn't reduced from last year. And 86% agree that immigrants are generally good for Australia's economy. So while the headlines are there at the moment, and we must understand where community is at on this, I think it's important also to understand that there is strong support as well. Finally, it's worth Well, two things. Firstly, as Ming said, we've been doing a lot of research on migration for a long time, and I was really pleased to hear the Minister referencing the work that we've done. It's great because it is just recognition, I think, for the hard work that the team's put in. But I also want to loop back to a comment I made in my opening remarks, which is that one of the things that we have been really trying to do is to work more closely with our members as well to understand how these policy issues are playing out in your organisations every day. And I think that's our strength at CEDA. We have a cross-sector footprint, so we've got members from the not-for-profit sector, members from universities, we've got government, we've got business, big and small. That is a unique perspective that I think allows us to distill down some insights which the government finds quite valuable. And we also have a footprint across the country, which allows us to look at the different complexion of national issues based on where we are in the country. So I say that by way of encouraging you in the audience and anyone who's watching online that if you are interested in this and you haven't been involved in our research, please let me or the team know. We're always keen to hear the perspective of our members and to understand how we can reflect that in evidence-based research to the government and to use your advocacy to make our work more relevant. The final point, I do want to echo Ming's comment around just taking a moment to reflect on some of the statistics and some of the information that we heard, which I think when you're in the audience, and I'll say this personally, we can kind of glide by and we look at numbers that tell us very clearly that people coming from overseas are not having the same experiences. We're underutilising skills and resources that we badly need in this country. And at the end of the day, someone has to hold the mirror up and say, is that me? Is my organisation doing what it should be doing? And when you see how profound the differences are, some of us are going to have to own up to it and really think about our own cultures and our own practices. And that's the only way that we're going to see the change that we need to see, so that in 5 or 10 years' time, hopefully we'll be putting the statistics up showing how those gaps have closed. And really, that's a win-win for the migrants themselves, for the employers, and for the Australian economy and community. So I guess just a moment of self-reflection for us all. I would again like to thank our sponsors. Teresa, you and Fragment have been with us for the long journey on this. Thank you so much. And Vet Assess for joining us in today's event as well. Thank you to all the speakers who made their time available. That's what makes these things worth attending for others in the room, so thank you so much for that. If you haven't had enough of CEDA, we've got a couple of interesting things that I'm just going to quickly plug that are coming up. We've got a live stream tomorrow actually on building a stronger Medicare system with the Honourable Mark Butler. And then to take a slight track in a different direction, we have the AI Leadership Summit here in Sydney on the 8th of December, full day. And there's an absolute cracking host of speakers and participants who are going to be attending that. So if you've got an interest in AI, please jump on the website and have a look, because that one's selling fast. Thank you again for being here. We're going to have drinks and reception outside for a little while afterwards, so you can mingle and network a little bit more. But thank you again for being here and for your support for CEDA and its work. Thank you.